In the spacious and luxurious meeting room atop one of New York's most prestigious hotels, the Harris family was gathered. All of the family's most notable members and a few trusted lawyers were present, each wearing expressions of anticipation and unease. At the center of it all was Walter Harris, a man in his 80s, still imposing and shrewd. He was the founder of the Harris Hotel Empire, one of the largest hotel chains in the United States, and he was there to make an announcement that had sparked rumors and speculations among his relatives for a long time. Henry Harris, his grandson and likely heir, watched his grandfather with an impatient gaze. He was a tall man, impeccably groomed, with dark hair and a serious face. He wore a perfectly tailored suit, reflecting his profile, a cold, direct businessman obsessed with control. Although many expected him to be the next to take over the company, Henry knew that nothing was ever guaranteed with his grandfather. Walter was the kind of man who always surprised people. Walter cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. He put on his glasses, observing each face with his usual calculated calm. Then, with a nod, he began what would be the family's most impactful announcement. "Today, I am here to speak about the future of the Harris Empire, my legacy," Walter began, his voice firm and direct. "As you all know, I have been evaluating for some time now which of you will take over the presidency and lead our company." Henry crossed his arms, keeping a straight face. He was almost certain about his role as the next leader. Since his youth, he had followed his grandfather closely, studied every business decision, and endured an exhausting work routine, all with one goal in mind: to inherit the Harris Empire and keep the family name among the country's elite. Despite his cold and professional exterior, Henry felt the weight of responsibility and craved Walter's acknowledgement. But as Walter continued his speech, an enigmatic expression formed on his face, and he directed a prolonged gaze at his grandson, as if about to reveal something crucial. "Henry, you have been groomed for this moment all your life. You know the value of our name and what it signifies, as well as the importance of maintaining it at the highest level," Walter said, as murmurs of approval filled the room. "However, I have come to the conclusion that there's more to leading a company than an impeccable resume and a calculated demeanor. Therefore, before handing the presidency to you, I have decided there will be a condition I believe is essential." Henry raised an eyebrow, intrigued. A condition? He had dedicated his life to the family business. What more could his grandfather want from him? "I'm listening, sir," Henry responded formally, maintaining his rigid stance. Walter smiled slightly, though with a hint of challenge in his eyes. He admired his grandson's controlled, calculated reaction, but knew that this time, he was about to shake even Henry's implacable discipline. "To take over the presidency and inherit the entire estate, you will have to commit in a less traditional way," Walter said, letting the tension hang in the air before continuing. "I want you to get married, or at the very least be engaged for 6 months." A stunned silence took over the room. Henry blinked slowly, trying to process what his grandfather had just said. "Married?" he repeated, with a tone of disbelief mixed with a touch of irritation. The other family members exchanged glances. Some appeared surprised. Others wore amused smiles at Henry's controlled but visibly displeased reaction. "Yes, my grandson. I want to see if you can build a genuine relationship, to commit to someone honestly and deeply. After all, if you can't lead in a personal relationship, how can I expect you to lead a company with compassion and empathy?" Walter replied with calm provocation. Henry swallowed hard, controlling his frustration. Marriage was not in his plans. He was dedicated to his work, and romance or commitment was the last item on his priority list. "And who would be this person I'm supposed to marry?" he asked, maintaining a cold tone. Walter crossed his arms and gave a slight smile, showing he had thought of everything. "Ava Brooks," he said without hesitation. The murmurs in the room grew. Many tried to remember who this woman was. Henry, for his part, was utterly confused. He expected, at the very least, an heiress, a socialite, or someone within his exclusive circle, but he had never heard of Ava Brooks. Who? He asked, unable to hide his tone of incredulity. Ava Brooks, Walter repeated confidently. She's a teacher at a public school in Brooklyn. I had the opportunity to meet her at a community event, and she made quite an impression on me. Henry watched his grandfather with a serious expression, feeling a mixture of frustration and confusion. He couldn't believe his grandfather actually wanted him to feign a relationship, and with a stranger no less. Sir, I understand the desire for me to commit, but with a public school teacher? Henry said, barely containing the hint of disdain. Walter sighed deeply, looking straight into his grandson's eyes. I chose Ava because she embodies everything you need to learn to value. She is kind, loyal, and understands the worth of simple things. Someone who lives in a very different reality from ours, and who can show you that there is more to life than luxury hotels and endless meetings. Walter explained, leaving no room for argument. No matter how hard Henry tried to remain calm, he couldn't believe his grandfather was serious about going through with this. How was he supposed to build a connection with someone he didn't even know? Someone who didn't belong to the business world or high social circles. Walter noticed his resistance and with a sigh, concluded, Henry, either you accept this condition and get engaged to Ava Brooks for 6 months, or I leave the control of the company and the inheritance to another relative willing to meet my conditions. This is my final word. The grandson knew that arguing was useless. Walter was inflexible once he made a decision. He watched his grandfather in silence, processing the situation. That very afternoon, in a bustling Brooklyn neighborhood, Ava Brooks was in a meeting with her students' parents. She loved her job as an elementary school teacher and was passionately dedicated to the children, who were the center of her life. Ava had a generous and simple spirit, far from luxuries or excessive ambitions. Her reality was helping her students and supporting her family, and she could hardly imagine that her name was being discussed miles away in a meeting of the powerful Harris family. While helping one of her students solve a math problem, her phone rang. She answered quickly, without much ceremony, thinking it was a routine call. Ava Brooks? Asked a serious and formal voice on the other end. Yes, that's me, she replied, suspicious. Miss Brooks, I'm an assistant to Mr. Walter Harris. He would like to arrange a meeting with you. The name sounded strange yet familiar. She knew the Harris hotels, of course, but had never been in contact with anyone that important. One moment, what does he want with me? Ava asked, confused. He will explain everything in person. Would it be possible to meet him tomorrow at 10 o'clock in the penthouse of the Harris Hotel in Manhattan? Still suspicious, Ava hesitated, but curiosity was strong. After all, how could the founder of one of the country's largest hotel chains want to speak with her? After confirming the meeting, she hung up and tried to return to her routine. But throughout the night, thoughts about the unusual invitation kept her awake, as if something big was about to happen. The next day, Ava arrived at the hotel, feeling out of place in such a luxurious setting. Marble walls, expensive chandeliers, impeccable floral arrangements, everything screamed opulence, something completely foreign to her world. She took a deep breath and went up to the penthouse, where she was greeted by Walter. Walter was cordial and polite, but direct. He explained the reason for his call, revealing the unusual agreement he had in mind. Ava could hardly believe what she was hearing. Be engaged to Henry Harris, an arrogant billionaire she didn't even know? With all due respect, sir, this sounds like nonsense, Ava exclaimed, unable to hide her surprise. Walter chuckled lightly, admiring her frankness. I understand it may seem that way, Ava, but I believe you have much to offer, both to Henry and to our family. It's a unique proposal, and I'd like you to consider it. At least for a few days, he said, offering a sympathetic look. Although reluctant, Ava realized that the proposal was indeed tempting. After all, the payment Walter offered could help her bring stability to her family and fulfill her own dreams. And so, with her heart torn between absurdity and opportunity. Ava left the hotel that day with an unusual invitation and the beginning of a new and mysterious journey. The morning after his meeting with his grandfather, Henry woke up with a growing sense of irritation. He was a practical, efficient man who hated wasting time. And now, much to his frustration, he was about to meet Ava Brooks, the woman who, according to his grandfather, would bring balance and humanity into his life. Henry could hardly believe what was happening. Sitting in the office of his Manhattan penthouse, he cast an impatient glance at the message, confirming the meeting he had arranged himself. Sullivan Cafe, 10 o'clock, it read, in a formal and professional tone he intended to maintain throughout the conversation. As he prepared, each movement was executed with the precision and speed typical of his routine. He donned a sharply tailored, classic suit, perfect for business meetings. His expression reflected pure determination, mixed with latent irritation. Deep down, he felt the whole situation was a joke, a monumental waste of time, but he knew he had no choice. If he wanted to inherit the family empire, he would at least have to listen to what this woman had to say. Ava arrived 10 minutes early. Sullivan Cafe, one of the trendiest spots in Brooklyn, was a cozy place with a bohemian vibe and a light decor that matched the neighborhood. Exposed brick walls, wooden chairs, and hanging lights created a warm atmosphere she adored. Wearing a casual floral dress, Ava was the picture of simplicity and calm. She had always been practical, but she admitted that this meeting made her nervous. Who does he think he is? Ava found herself thinking, still unsettled by the events of the previous day. Accepting Henry's grandfather's proposal to consider the arrangement had already been surreal, but now she was about to face Henry Harris himself, a man reputed around town as ruthless in business and devoid of warmth in personal dealings. She wondered how someone so hardened and disdainful could even consider faking a relationship. As the clock struck exactly 10, Henry entered the cafe, his piercing gaze sweeping the place until he spotted Ava seated by the window. He took a deep breath, donning an expression of coldness as he walked toward her. Ava straightened in her chair, trying to hide her growing unease. "Ava Brooks?" he asked without any introduction or courtesy, as if confirming a service request. Ava raised her eyebrows, slightly surprised by his lack of politeness. "Yes." "And you must be Henry Harris," she replied, maintaining her composure. Henry nodded, but instead of sitting down immediately, he scrutinized the table where Ava sat. Noting that it was a smaller table, uncomfortably close to other people, he frowned. "It's cramped here, don't you think?" he commented with a slight tone of disdain. "Isn't there a more private spot?" Ava let out a brief laugh, unable to hide the irony. "It seems perfect to me. Or do you prefer a corporate office, even for coffee?" She shot back, her eyes gleaming with a hint of provocation. Henry frowned, already irritated, but sat down, trying to ignore her sharp response. He took a deep breath before speaking, giving Ava an appraising look, as if searching for any weakness or hesitation. "Well, Ava, I'm here for one reason only. And I want to make it clear from the outset that I don't approve of this absurd situation," he said in a dry tone. "We're in agreement then." "I don't think it's a good idea either," she replied, her gaze fixed on him, unwavering. Henry leaned forward slightly, appearing even more irritated. Accustomed to people bowing to him, this woman was displaying an unexpected boldness. "Great, then let's be direct." He clasped his hands, resting his elbows on the table. "My grandfather insists that I get involved with you, but frankly, I see no sense in it. I'm a businessman, Ava. I work with logic and results. This romantic charade is a nonsense for someone in my position." Ava crossed her arms, watching him with a skeptical expression. "Interesting. And why do you think I'd be impressed by your business status?" she asked with a hint of sarcasm. "I live in the real world, Henry. And to me, that doesn't make the slightest difference." He shook his head, a cynical smile appearing on his lips. "You know, Ava, maybe that's precisely why my grandfather chose you. He seems to think you can "Humanize me," he said, using air quotes around his grandfather's words. Ava gave a short laugh, unable to hide her disdain. Does he really believe that? "I'm not a therapist, Henry. I'm a teacher. I work with children who face real problems. Not with," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "spoiled, arrogant businessmen who think the world should revolve around them." Henry blinked, surprised by her blunt response. No one had ever spoken to him like that, and he didn't like it one bit. "I have what it takes to make the world revolve around me, Ava. It's a matter of competence. The only reason I'm here is that I need to comply with my grandfather's demands," he retorted, keeping an impassive expression. Ava looked at him for a long moment, sensing that behind that facade lay a void of empathy. "You see me as a project, don't you? An obstacle in your way," she said, with a tone of challenge. "But guess what? I also have my priorities. And pretending I'm in love with you is far from one of them." Henry huffed, visibly annoyed. "This is a business proposal, Ava. Just 6 months of engagement, a few public appearances, and in the end, we both benefit. There doesn't need to be anything romantic about it. You know, when your grandfather said you needed to learn something about empathy, he was being kind. Because from the way you talk, the only thing I see in you is arrogance," Ava shot back, her gaze steady. Henry leaned in closer, the tension in the air almost palpable. "And the only thing I see in you, Ava, is an idealistic teacher who thinks she's superior to the spoiled billionaire here. But for your information, my time is worth millions, and I'm already spending too much on this pointless conversation." Ava took a deep breath, controlling the urge to stand up and leave. She knew that, difficult as it might be, this proposal was also a unique chance for her and her family, something that could bring them financial stability and help fulfill dreams she had long held close. But working with a man like Henry was a daunting prospect. "Listen, Henry, the difference between us is simple. You do everything for status and control. I do things for something greater, whether it's helping my students or supporting my family. If I agree to this, it will be for the people who depend on me. And honestly, I'm not going to waste my time pretending to like you." Henry kept his gaze steady. He realized that Ava was everything he wasn't used to, but perhaps exactly what his grandfather had hoped for, a woman who wouldn't bow her head. "In that case, Ava, I propose something clear and simple. We'll be partners in appearance. We'll maintain a professional relationship, with no illusions of friendship or anything like that. We do what's necessary, and at the end, we each go our separate ways." Ava hesitated, and for a moment, her eyes met his. There was a seriousness, an unexpected honesty in his words that she hadn't expected. She knew that if she said no, she'd return to her simple, peaceful life, but she'd also be giving up a unique opportunity to help herself and her loved ones. "All right, 6 months. But just know it won't be easy, Henry. And if you expect me to change to fit into your perfect little world, you're mistaken." Henry offered a cold smile. "I expect nothing, Ava, and that's just as well." The first meeting to establish the terms of their relationship took place only 2 days after their disastrous encounter at the cafe. The atmosphere between Henry and Ava was tense, like a charged cloud looming over them. They met in the conference room of one of Henry's offices, an elegant and modern space with large glass windows offering a sweeping view of the city. Natural light poured in, illuminating the sophisticated setting, and Henry, as always impeccable, wore a dark suit that contrasted with his serious expression. Ava arrived on time, but with a defensive stance. She was dressed more formally than usual, a simple yet elegant blouse and a skirt that fell to her knee, giving her a more serious air than usual. From their first encounter, she was determined to show Henry that she was more than just a public school teacher. She was a woman capable of handling him and anyone from his world. As soon as she entered, Henry barely looked up from his laptop, busy checking a few last-minute emails. He motioned for Ava to sit, only closing the laptop once she was seated, assuming an expression of pure professionalism. "I see you're on time, Miss Brooks," he said, emotionlessly. "Good morning to you too, Henry," Ava replied, with a slight hint of sarcasm but keeping her composure. Henry took a deep breath and, wasting no time, placed a folder on the table. "Let's get straight to the point. I've prepared a list of conditions I expect us to follow. I think this way we can avoid misunderstandings." Ava rolled her eyes but nodded. She knew that this conversation was necessary, although she was certain they would disagree on almost everything. Henry opened the folder and handed her a multi-page document. The initial page had the title printed in bold: Engagement Agreement Terms between Henry Harris and Ava Brooks. She couldn't help but let out an ironic laugh upon reading the title. "You actually drafted an engagement contract?" she asked, amid a sigh of disbelief. Henry gave her a serious look. "This contract will protect both of us. I'm a businessman, Ava. We work with formal documents to keep everything clear. I think it's prudent we do the same here, given that there's no trust involved." Ava scoffed but prepared herself to tackle the document. It wasn't just any document. It looked more like a business contract, with clauses detailing every aspect of their fake relationship. Ava skimmed the first lines, and as she read, her eyes widened. She shot Henry a critical look. "No emotional involvement?" she read aloud, as if the phrase were entirely absurd. Henry crossed his arms, nodding. "Exactly. We agree that this is a professional arrangement. If there's any emotional involvement, which is highly unlikely, it would complicate the purpose of our partnership. So no emotional involvement is a fundamental premise. Can we stick to that?" Ava shook her head, still trying to process the formality of what Henry was proposing. But deep down, she knew he was right. The less they got involved, the easier it would be to treat this as a temporary contract. "All right, that aligns with my expectations," she replied, trying to keep her voice calm. "Let's focus on the financial aspect then. If I'm going to dedicate 6 months of my life to this, I want guarantees. Something concrete, especially regarding the compensation amount." Henry nodded, satisfied with her pragmatism in that moment. "I've already set the exact amount in payment conditions." He slid a sheet over to her, detailing the sum he considered fair for the 6 months. "This amount will be divided into 3 installments, one at the start of the agreement, one at the 3rd month, and the final at the end of the 6 months, provided all conditions are met." Ava examined the proposal carefully. Although she wasn't someone driven by greed, the proposed amount was substantial, enough to secure financial stability for her family for years. She bit her lip, weighing whether it was truly worth it. After a few minutes in silence, she finally nodded. "Agreed then." She set aside the sheet with the financial details. "And I also have conditions. Some of them pertain to my privacy." Henry raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Go on." "During these 6 months, I want to keep my life as normal as possible. That means I won't be quitting my job, and I expect you to respect my schedule. I'm not a puppet for events. If I need to attend an event outside of what's stipulated, it should be communicated in advance, and I'll only accept if it's genuinely necessary to maintain appearances." Henry listened attentively, apparently accepting Ava's terms. "All right. I understand that your work is important to you." He noted down her conditions and then continued. "Now, regarding public appearances. Every week, there will be at least 1 or 2 public appearances. We'll need to attend important events together, where we can be photographed and seen by the media. This will serve to validate our relationship in the eyes of my grandfather and the public." Ava suppressed a sigh of frustration. She had anticipated this, but the idea of being a display doll deeply bothered her. Nevertheless, she maintained her firm stance, so be it. But no excesses. "I have a life outside this contract, and I won't neglect my responsibilities. I'll attend what's essential, but with clear limits." Henry quickly jotted down her agreement, albeit with some reluctance. He wasn't used to yielding in negotiations, but he knew he needed Ava's commitment. In any case, 6 months seemed a reasonable time frame to him. enough to fulfill his grandfather's wishes and leave it all behind. "One more thing, Ava," he added, leaning slightly forward. "We'll need some rules for public behavior. We need to appear comfortable together." Ava raised an eyebrow, frowning. "Comfortable?" she repeated in a skeptical tone. "And what exactly do you mean by that?" Henry sighed, as if it were obvious. "It means that in public, we can't act like two complete strangers. We'll need to behave in a convincing way. Small doses of affection, subtle physical contact. And when I say subtle, I mean discreet, nothing exaggerated." She rolled her eyes, feeling an odd discomfort at the idea of faking intimacy with someone she barely knew, and worse, someone as insufferable as Henry. "Let's define the limits of these doses of affection, then," she replied. "I'm not going to act like a soap opera actress. Kissing only if absolutely necessary, and physical contact will be limited to the minimum needed to maintain appearances." Henry nodded, agreeing to her terms, though a slight discomfort lingered in the air. Both were aware that this arrangement was a risky game, one that tested their own expectations and patience. But despite the tension, the contract was finally adjusted. At the end of that meeting, Henry closed the folder, giving Ava a final look, as if to reinforce the seriousness of what they had just signed. "Very well. Now that we're in agreement, let's proceed with the plan. First event, next Friday. It's a company cocktail party, and I need you there at my side. Impeccable." Ava nodded, determined to go through with the agreement and keep a professional demeanor. She stood up, picking up her bag, and gave him one last look before leaving. "Very well, Henry. But remember, to me, all of this is just theater. When the 6 months are over, we'll each go our separate ways, as if none of this ever happened." He smiled, a cold, calculating smile, and replied with conviction. "You have my word, Ava." On Friday night, Henry and Ava were about to make their first public appearance together. The event was an elegant cocktail party hosted by the Harris Group, held in one of the company's most prestigious hotels in Manhattan. The ballroom, lit by crystal chandeliers and decorated with white and gold flower arrangements, was filled with business executives, shareholders, and members of the city's elite. Well-dressed men and women circulated with champagne flutes in hand, exchanging calculated smiles and rehearsed greetings. Henry was in the ballroom, chatting with some investors, but his mind was focused on one thing: the impact Ava's entrance would soon create. Their relationship was fake, but it was essential that everything seemed genuine. He wanted everyone to believe he was truly committed, yet his primary concern lay elsewhere. He knew Ava well enough to know she hated social events, which made him tense, wondering how she would handle the stares and expectations. Suddenly, he saw her. Ava had just entered the ballroom, and even among so many sophisticated people, she stood out instantly. She wore a black satin dress that fit her curves perfectly, with a discreet yet elegant neckline. Her hair was styled in a low bun, with a few loose strands framing her face softly. She looked both delicate and strong, and Henry felt a slight twinge of surprise, realizing how stunning she was. She walked toward him with steady steps, an elegant smile on her lips, but with a defiant gleam in her eyes. When she finally stopped beside him, Henry kept his composure, but couldn't help making a comment. "You look presentable," he said quietly, keeping his tone neutral. Ava raised an eyebrow, giving him a look that blended irony and amusement. "Thank you for the compliment, Henry. You almost sound sincere," she replied with a slight, teasing smile. Henry ignored the provocation and extended his arm, offering it to her to make them appear closer. Ava hesitated for a brief second, but accepted the gesture, intertwining her arm with his. The feeling of proximity between them was unexpectedly disconcerting for both, though neither showed it. As they approached the group of investors, Henry introduced Ava in a firm tone with a slight smile. "This is Ava Brooks, my fiancée." The looks from the guests ranged from surprise to curiosity. After all, no one expected Henry, known for his cold and distant demeanor, to appear with a fiancée so suddenly, much less someone like Ava, who seemed completely different from the women he was usually seen with. Ava kept a polite smile and engaged with the investors effortlessly. To Henry's surprise, she handled the greetings and questions with admirable confidence. She smiled and responded to every comment with a mix of grace and wit that charmed everyone. Some investors even seemed more interested in their story than in the event itself, which clearly irritated Henry. "How did you two meet?" asked one of the ladies present, an investor who had been with the Harris Group for years. Before Henry could respond with something simple and evasive, Ava gave a slightly mischievous smile and joined the conversation. "Oh, it was quite unexpected," she replied, casting a subtly provocative look at Henry. "Henry was so focused on impressing me that he even approached me in the coffee line just to ask for my number. I couldn't resist." Henry's eyes narrowed slightly at Ava's response, but he had no choice but to play along. He gave a small smile, pretending to agree. "It was a casual but unforgettable encounter," he added, keeping his tone neutral. The investors laughed and exchanged knowing looks, clearly enchanted by the story and the chemistry between the two. It was obvious to everyone that despite the formal words, there was something unusual in the way Henry and Ava interacted, as if the tension between them were part of the relationship itself. As the night wore on, Henry tried to keep the situation under control. However, Ava seized every opportunity to subtly mock his seriousness and arrogance, making astute comments that challenged him at every turn. In one interaction with a group of guests, Henry, while mentioning the growth in investments, paused briefly to allow Ava to comment. "And that's what I admire about him," she said, with an ironic look that only he seemed to notice. "Henry is so focused, determined, almost obsessive, I'd say. He certainly knows how to make every second productive." One of the guests, picking up on Ava's subtly provocative tone, burst into laughter, and Henry had to make an effort to contain his own irritation. After they moved away from the group, he whispered to Ava through gritted teeth, "No need to exaggerate so much. This is a formality, remember?" Ava responded, equally in a low tone with a calm smile. "I'm just doing what we agreed, Henry. I thought you wanted to convince everyone. And honestly, you're so rigid that it might be good for them to see you're not made of ice." Henry huffed but kept his composure. He knew that, to others, they looked like a perfectly balanced couple, and that was enough. However, he also knew that Ava was taking every opportunity to annoy him. With each smile she directed at him, there was a hint of sarcasm, a touch of irony that only he seemed to pick up on. And she made sure to stay firm. Throughout the rest of the evening, Ava surprised Henry by showing an unexpected skill for socializing, adapting to the circles of investors and executives as if she'd always been part of that world. When one of Henry's longtime friends, Michael, approached them, he didn't miss the chance to joke. "Finally found someone to soften that stone heart of yours, huh, Henry? Who would have thought?" Henry smiled, but inside he felt a growing discomfort. This fake relationship was becoming more complex than he'd anticipated, especially since Ava didn't follow the scripts he was used to controlling. She was unpredictable, and her willingness to challenge him put him in an uncomfortable position. "Actually, Michael, I think it was a stroke of luck," Ava said, with a mischievous smile. "I just hope he doesn't make me work too hard." Michael laughed and gave Henry a friendly pat on the shoulder, while Henry tried to mask his growing embarrassment. He was used to being admired and respected, not the target of jokes. However, when he looked at Ava, he noticed something that bothered him even more. People genuinely liked her, and it wasn't just out of politeness. She made people laugh, relax, while he seemed like just another piece of a rigid, impersonal system. When the night finally came to an end, Henry and Ava withdrew to a quieter corner. They were both tired, and they both knew that this was only the first of many nights like this. "I'll admit, you surprised me," Henry said, crossing his arms. "You handled it better than I expected." Ava smiled, satisfied with his reaction. "It's what I said, Henry. I may be a teacher, but that doesn't mean I don't know how to handle any situation. Unlike you, who seem trapped in a corporate robot mold." He raised an eyebrow, the hint of a challenge creeping into his own tone. "Maybe it's that corporate robot that will ensure you get the security you need over these 6 months." She laughed, shaking her head. "You don't get it, do you?" She replied, exasperated. "It's not about status or power, Henry. It's about freedom. I'm doing this for what comes after, for what this can provide for me and my family. You don't understand that because your world revolves around keeping up appearances." Henry held her gaze, and for a moment, there was a pause. It was true that he didn't fully understand what she meant, and that irritated him. He had always believed that his position, control, and respect were everything. But at that moment, something in her candor made him question his own convictions. "You really don't hold back from saying what you think, do you?" he murmured, more to himself than to her. Ava shrugged, keeping her gaze steady. "It's the only way to survive this, Henry. If I swallowed everything you say without pushing back, this charade would be unbearable." He smiled slightly, impressed by her courage but also unsettled by facing someone who wouldn't bow to his influence. "Let's see how long this attitude lasts," he said, his tone a mix of challenge and amusement. Ava returned his gaze, a carefree smile on her lips. "You can bet, Henry. It won't be easy for either of us." And with that, they left, each absorbed in their own conflicting thoughts and emotions. From that night, Henry knew these 6 months would be challenging in a way he hadn't anticipated. And although both denied it fervently, the magnetism between them was becoming evident, something even a rigid contract couldn't control. The invitation to dinner at the Harris family home arrived at the beginning of the week, and as soon as she read Henry's message, Ava felt a knot in her stomach. She knew that a family dinner would be the true test of her acting skills. The Harris family was known for their strictness and formality, and Ava could imagine the inquisitive look she'd face. As if that wasn't enough, she'd have to deal with Henry by her side, watching her every move and reaction. The night of the dinner finally arrived, and Henry came to pick Ava up from her Manhattan apartment. When she came down, he observed her for a moment in silence. Ava wore a dark blue dress, elegant yet understated. The light fabric draped softly over her, and her hair was loose, cascading in natural waves. She looked calm, but Henry knew she must be nervous inside. He noticed a subtle glimmer of tension in her eyes, something that made her even more beautiful and real. "Ready to face the Harrises?" he asked, trying to break the ice. She gave a confident smile, though it couldn't hide a touch of irony. "You say that like I'm going to court, Henry. It's just a family dinner." Henry smiled, but there was a seriousness in his gaze. "In my family, dinners can be more intimidating than any courtroom. They're all ready to judge your every move." Ava sighed, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Fantastic. I'll pretend that doesn't worry me, and who knows, maybe I'll even enjoy it." He looked at her, intrigued by her challenging tone. They opened the car doors and headed toward the Harris family mansion, a grand estate in the most exclusive part of the Upper East Side. As they arrived, Ava felt the grandeur and imposing nature of the house. The Harris mansion was an imposing classic, with white columns and architecture that looked like something out of a European palace. The interior was even more impressive. Crystal chandeliers hung from high ceilings, the walls were adorned with original works of art, and the entire environment exuded sophistication and an elegant chilliness. Henry noticed Ava's gaze as she absorbed every detail around her, and he made a brief comment. "Welcome to the Harris residence. I hope you don't feel too intimidated." She looked at him, raising an eyebrow with a defiant smile. "Not bad. Although I prefer a place where I can breathe without fear of breaking something." Before Henry could respond, a firm and familiar voice echoed through the entrance hall. "Henry, finally. And you must be Ava." Walter Harris, the family patriarch, stood before them. He was a man of presence, impeccably dressed in a suit, and with an intense gaze that analyzed every detail. Even in his 80s, Walter exuded strength and authority. Ava smiled, extending her hand to greet him. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Harris." Walter shook her hand firmly, his eyes examining her with an intensity that made her feel as if she were under a magnifying glass. She maintained a steady smile, determined not to let any insecurity show. "The pleasure is mine, Ava. I've been eager to meet you." "Henry has told us a lot about you," Walter replied, casting a brief glance at his grandson, who maintained a neutral expression. Ava just smiled, knowing that a lot was probably one of the most polite lies she'd ever heard. Henry wouldn't mention her more than absolutely necessary. Walter turned and guided them to the dining room, where the other family members were gathered. Ava felt the eyes of Henry's relatives, as if each one were trying to decipher her in a few seconds. His aunts, cousins, and even Henry's mother, Helen, observed her with curiosity and veiled judgment. It was as if her every movement was a test. As everyone sat down at the table, the dinner began with formal and discreet conversation, but it was evident that Ava was the center of attention. She tried to maintain her composure, smiling politely and answering questions with caution. Some family members asked about her work, and she calmly explained her role as a teacher, highlighting the importance of her profession. However, a few subtle responses hinted at some family members' unspoken opinions about her status. So Ava asked Helen, Henry's mother, with a calculated smile, "How do you handle the difference between your routine and Henry's? It must be quite a shock for someone from your field." Ava smiled, refusing to be intimidated. "It's certainly a contrast, but at the same time, it's a matter of perspective. I believe there's a lot to learn from every experience, whether in a luxury hotel or a classroom filled with curious children. Both worlds have their challenges and rewards." Henry observed the conversation, noticing that Ava was handling herself better than he had anticipated. She dealt with each question with unexpected elegance, and even his grandfather seemed interested in the way she answered. The dinner continued, and eventually, the conversation drifted to more informal topics. Walter, who had been quietly observing, decided to engage Ava directly. "Tell me, Ava, what exactly attracted you to Henry?" he asked in a tone that mixed genuine curiosity and a hint of teasing. Ava cast a quick glance at Henry, who was watching her with a cautious expression, waiting for her response. She then gave a subtle smile, deciding to play along with the same irony. "Oh, Henry has a unique determination. He knows exactly what he wants and spares no effort to get it. I think I admire that strength." She looked at Henry with a playful glint in her eyes and added, "Sometimes he's a bit inflexible, but I suppose that's part of his charm." Walter chuckled briefly, clearly amused by her response. "A diplomatic answer," he commented approvingly. "I like you, Ava. Not everyone can handle my grandson's personality." Henry shifted discreetly in his chair, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. But to his surprise, he didn't feel his usual irritation. There was something in that interaction that made him see Ava in a new light. She wasn't just there to play a role. She subtly challenged expectations, and his grandfather clearly noticed it. As dinner neared its end, Walter gestured for Ava to join him in the library, leaving Henry and the rest of the family at the table. Henry watched the scene with a mix of concern and curiosity. His grandfather rarely showed this kind of interest in anyone unless it was extremely serious. In the library, Walter and Ava sat in two dark leather armchairs, and he observed her for a few moments in silence before speaking. "Ava, I have to admit, my family didn't expect someone like you by Henry's side." "That's obvious. I think even you noticed," he said with a penetrating look. She nodded, keeping her gaze steady. "It doesn't surprise me, Mr. Harris. And honestly, I understand their doubts. My reality is different from yours. But I can assure you, I'm here to support Henry as best as I can, and to fulfill the terms of our agreement." Walter smiled slightly, seeming satisfied with her answer. "You know, Ava, wealth and power are fragile illusions. In the end, what really matters are the connections we make and the lessons we learn. I believe there's a reason why you and Henry crossed paths." Ava looked at him, intrigued. The old man's tone was serious, almost as if there was a deeper intention behind his words. "Henry is a good man, but his life has been shaped by rigid rules and family pressures. He needs someone to help him see beyond that, someone who challenges him but also stays true to him." "Are you that person, Ava?" She hesitated for a moment, considering the question. Her connection with Henry was anything but real, yet there was a sincerity in her actions, a willingness to uphold the agreement and to challenge him whenever necessary. "I'm not sure if I'm the person you expect," she finally said, with a small, shy smile. "But I promise to be honest and genuine during these 6 months, no matter what happens." Walter nodded, appearing satisfied. "That's all I ask, Ava. And one more thing. Henry may be inflexible and impatient, but he deeply cares for those he loves, even if he doesn't show it. I hope you can help him find some peace beyond the obligations that surround him." Ava kept her smile, understanding what he was saying, even if it was an unusual request. As they returned to the dining room, Henry looked at her with a curious expression, as if trying to decipher what had transpired in the library. On the drive back, the silence in the car was comfortable but thick with meaning. Henry finally broke the silence, casting a curious look her way. "What did my grandfather want with you?" She smiled, looking out the window as she reflected on the meeting. "Just to talk, and give me a few pieces of advice about you. It seems he's very proud of who you are, but he also seems concerned." Henry remained silent, absorbing her response. That night had changed something within him, even if he didn't want to admit it. There was something about Ava that made him question his own values, something that his grandfather seemed to see before he did. The first family dinner was over, but what was beginning to form between Henry and Ava was a relationship far more complex than either was prepared to admit. The dynamic between Henry and Ava intensified after the dinner at the Harris family home. Henry, used to controlling every situation, began to see his relationship with Ava as a sort of power game. She wasn't impressed by his status, nor was she intimidated by his attempts to assert dominance. This bothered him deeply, but it also intrigued him. The following week, Henry decided to test Ava's limits in a more daring way. He knew she wasn't accustomed to the luxurious world he frequented, and decided to introduce her to it in a calculated manner. After all, if she wanted to play her role perfectly, she'd need to learn to survive in the world of demands and appearances he lived in. The first test came at a charity event organized by the Harris Group. The charity auction brought together top figures from New York's elite and was held in an extravagant hall adorned with artwork and floral arrangements that looked like they came straight from an exhibit. Ava knew it would be an intense night, but she was ready for the challenge. When they arrived at the event, Henry introduced her to several important personalities from the business world, people who clearly cared more about power and influence than about charity. Ava noticed the many glances cast her way, some discreet, others openly judgmental. Still, she maintained a polite smile and responded firmly and naturally to each comment. During the auction, Henry made sure to put her in awkward situations. At one point, one of the items on auction was a sophisticated piece of jewelry. Henry, with a malicious smile, placed a high bid and turned to Ava, as if expecting an exaggerated reaction from her. "I hope you like this sort of accessory, Ava. This piece seems appropriate for someone of your new status," he said, emphasizing the last part with a mix of sarcasm and challenge. Ava held back the urge to roll her eyes and kept her steady smile. "Oh, Henry, there's no need to spend so much to impress me. I'm perfectly happy with simple things, you know." "Something you may not understand," she replied, giving him a pointed look that showed she wasn't the least bit intimidated. Ava's response elicited a few discreet smiles from those around, and Henry found himself in an uncomfortable position, as though he had momentarily lost control. He tried not to show it, but her gaze challenged him in a way no one else dared to. The following weekend, Henry invited Ava to a dinner with European associates from the Harris Group. He knew the guests were conservative and had a strict sense of formality, which would make the occasion even more complicated for Ava, who was always willing to speak her mind. Upon arrival, Henry made a point of advising her on the expected behavior, as though he were dealing with an employee. Just keep the conversation to a minimum, Ava. These associates are very formal and prefer business-oriented discussions. No talk of personal experiences, he said with a tone of superiority. Ava smiled, but her eyes flashed with irritation. Understood, Henry. I'll behave. Just the way you like to see me, isn't it? The dinner began, and as expected, the associates talked almost exclusively about investment strategies and figures, a topic Ava found dreadfully boring. However, when she heard one of the investors arrogantly comment that public education in the United States is a complete failure, she couldn't contain herself. Interesting to hear that from someone who's never had direct experience with the public education system. Ava interjected, her tone firm but polite. The challenges are real, of course, but what I see every day are children and teachers who struggle to do their best with the resources available. It's not a failure, but a lack of investment. The associate's gaze turned cold, but Ava showed no sign of backing down. Henry watched the scene with interest. He had been expecting her to falter, but instead, she showed even more determination. The strength with which Ava defended her point of view surprised him. When the dinner ended, Henry and Ava left the restaurant, and he couldn't resist provoking her. You almost cost me a contract tonight, Ava. That was impulsive. She stopped, turning to him with a serious look. Did you bring me here to be a display doll, or to be myself? I won't stay silent when I see someone being unfair about something I truly understand. He smiled, surprised by her response. It was a reaction that, in some way, he admired, even if he wouldn't admit it to himself. You're unpredictable, Ava. Somewhat. Rebellious for what we agreed on. And you, Henry, are too rigid to open yourself to other perspectives. Maybe it would do you some good to see the world with a bit more flexibility, she retorted with a challenging smile. A week later, Henry decided to test Ava at the biggest social event of the season, the Magnates Gala, held at one of New York's most prestigious venues. The gala brought together not only business leaders and investors, but also celebrities and high society figures. It was a night when all eyes were on who was in attendance, and Henry knew that Ava would feel uncomfortable with so much exposure. However, Ava showed up looking stunning. She wore a long red dress that accentuated her slender figure and matched perfectly with her intense red lipstick. Her hair was styled in an elegant updo, with a few loose strands framing her face. Even though this wasn't her typical setting, she looked absolutely confident. Henry watched her as she descended the stairs, and for a moment, he felt impressed. She had a strength and determination he didn't fully understand, but that intrigued him. I didn't know you had this side, he commented, a slight smile of admiration appearing on his lips. She gave him a defiant look. I'm full of surprises, Henry, but you probably won't ever get to know them all. As they entered the ballroom, Henry guided her to some of the most important guests, including CEOs and political figures. Ava, maintaining her poise, conversed naturally, even as she noticed some judgmental glances directed her way. At one point, a well-known socialite, Marianne Fitzgerald, approached with a condescending smile. Oh, Henry, you brought someone? Interesting tonight. And you, Ava, what do you do for a living? Marianne asked with a tone that clearly underestimated Ava. Ava smiled, her gaze sharp. I'm a teacher. I work with children. It's a profession that requires a lot of patience and dedication, she replied, not breaking eye contact. Marianne raised her eyebrows, a shadow of disdain crossing her face. How noble. It must be challenging, right? I imagine it's not easy to stay interested in something so far from the business world. Before Henry could intervene, Ava responded, her smile resolute. Actually, Marianne, teaching children can be more challenging than dealing with adults at events like this. It's a matter of purpose, and mine is to help build futures. Perhaps you don't understand, but for me, it's just as important as any executive position." Henry observed, both surprised and unexpectedly proud of the way Ava held her ground. The socialite walked away with a forced smile, and Henry, who had initially planned to use the evening to test her, felt an unexpected admiration. At the end of the event, as they walked to the car, he broke the silence. "You really surprised me tonight. Not everyone challenges people like Marianne Fitzgerald." She laughed, but her gaze was steady. "If you want to see me stumble, Henry, you'll have to try a lot harder. I'm not as fragile as you think." Henry looked at her with a serious expression, realizing that, more and more, his attempts at control were failing. Ava wasn't like anyone he knew. She wasn't intimidated, nor was she impressed by his power. And this made him question what he expected from her, or what he expected from himself. As the car pulled away, he realized that, for the first time, she was winning the game he had started. After weeks of tense events, implicit challenges, and interactions full of provocations, Henry and Ava once again found themselves in an unexpected situation. A company gala held at one of the luxury hotels of the Harris Group. The night was a success, with Henry and Ava perfectly playing their roles as a couple. However, as the guests started leaving the event, a feeling of exhaustion overtook them both, and for the first time, they felt equally drained from maintaining the pretense. As the ballroom lights began to dim, Henry, perhaps driven by an unusual impulse, suggested they go to the hotel bar. Ava hesitated for a moment, but seeing the fatigue in Henry's eyes and feeling her own need to unwind, she agreed. Perhaps it would be good to let their guards down for just one night. The bar was elegant and quiet, with soft lighting that created an intimate atmosphere. They sat at a secluded table, and Henry made a point of ordering the best bottle of whiskey the bar had. Ava observed him with curiosity. This wasn't the usual Henry, always formal and in control. There was something in his expression that seemed more human. When the waiter brought the drinks, Henry poured a glass for Ava and then for himself. He raised his glass, smiling with a hint of irony. "To our flawless performance," he toasted, a tired smile on his face. Ava laughed, and they clinked glasses. The liquid went down warm, and as the alcohol took effect, she began to feel the tension of the day dissolve. They started by talking about trivial things, each keeping a certain emotional distance. But as the level of whiskey in the bottle lowered, the conversation became more relaxed, and their barriers began to drop. At one point, Ava paused and looked at Henry for a few moments, a slight smile forming on her lips. "You never relax, do you?" she asked, her tone curious. Henry raised an eyebrow, but there was a hint of vulnerability in his smile. "I suppose I never really learned how," he replied, swirling his glass. "I grew up in an environment where any weakness could be used against me. I got used to always keeping control." Ava nodded, understanding more than he might have realized. She took a deep breath, as if deciding whether or not to share something herself. "You know, when my father got sick, our life turned upside down," she began, her tone more serious than usual. "I was very young, and my mother was desperate to handle the medical bills. I started to see the world differently, Henry. I learned that sometimes, no matter how hard you try, life can be cruel." Henry remained silent, watching Ava's face. There was pain there, a vulnerability he had never seen in her. Seeing that made him view her differently. She wasn't just the strong, defiant woman who faced everything head-on. Ava carried scars, marks she hid, but that deeply shaped her personality. "You always seem so strong," he said, his voice softer than usual. "I never thought you'd been through something like that." Ava laughed softly, but it was a humorless laugh. "Everyone has their battles, Henry. Some people just learn to hide them better. I grew up having to be the strong one for my family, and it taught me to handle adversity, or at least hide it." Henry continued to listen silently, absorbing her words. He had never imagined Ava had been through so much. In his mind, she had always been just an ordinary woman, maybe even too simple to understand his world. But now he saw her as someone who had faced challenges with unshakable determination. "I think you're stronger than I am, Ava," he murmured, as if admitting something to himself. Ava looked up, surprised by his confession. She was used to the arrogant Henry, always ready to control her and underestimate her. That night, however, was revealing a side of him she hadn't expected to see. Someone who perhaps wasn't as cold as he appeared. They sat in silence for a few minutes, each immersed in their own thoughts. The whiskey continued to flow, and Henry, finally feeling more at ease, began to speak, his voice low, as if sharing a secret. "My grandfather always had high expectations for me. Since I was a child, I was trained to take his place. I had to be perfect, always do what was right for the company, for the family. And with every step, every choice, I felt the weight of not being able to fail. It's like my life was never really mine." Ava looked at him with compassion, and something within her made her move a little closer, reaching out to touch his arm lightly. That small gesture seemed unexpected even to her, but it was genuine. "That must be a hard burden to carry," she said gently. "Living with so much pressure, without room to make mistakes. No one should have to live like that." Henry remained silent, but her touch comforted him in a way he hadn't anticipated. He looked down at Ava's hand on his arm, and a strange warmth spread through him. It was a simple gesture, yet it carried empathy, something he rarely experienced. "And you?" he asked, turning to look at her. "You've always had to carry your family, haven't you?" Ava nodded, briefly looking away as she struggled against the emotions surfacing. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling. "I was always responsible for everything. After my father got sick, I had to grow up fast. I became the protector of my family." Henry watched her intently, sensing the pain in her voice, and realized that despite the provocations and challenges, they shared something: the weight of responsibility and the wounds they hid. It was an unexpected but real connection. "Ava, I never thought I'd say this, but I think I admire you," he admitted softly. "You're stronger than anyone I know." She smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her face. "And I thought you were a heartless robot," she replied, with a touch of humor. "Maybe you do have a human side after all, Henry." They laughed, and the heaviness of the night seemed to dissipate. What had begun as a simple power game between them was slowly turning into something deeper, something both felt, but neither dared to admit. For the first time, they were genuinely connecting, sharing secrets and revealing vulnerabilities. They talked until the bar was nearly closing, sharing stories about their families, unfulfilled dreams, and the pressures they both faced. There was mutual understanding, an acknowledgement that despite their differences, they had more in common than they realized. When they finally decided to leave, Henry offered to walk her to her apartment, and this time, she didn't refuse. In the car, the silence was comfortable, each lost in the memories of that unexpected conversation. When they arrived at her building's entrance, Henry helped her out of the car, and they found themselves standing face to face, a moment of hesitation hanging between them. "Thank you for tonight, Henry," she said sincerely. "I think for a few moments, it was nice not to pretend we're just contract partners." Henry nodded, a slight smile on his lips. "You know, Ava, I enjoyed it too. Maybe we needed this. Maybe we needed to be honest at least once." They stood in silence, their eyes meeting, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to fade. Henry, almost without realizing it, leaned in a little closer, and Ava, hesitant, did the same. But just as they were inches apart, they both pulled back as if waking from a dream. Ava smiled shyly and took a step back, regaining her composure. "Good night, Henry. Take care." "Good night, Ava," he replied, his voice low, carrying a restrained emotion. She entered her building, and Henry stood there for a moment, watching the door close. Inside the car, reflecting on the night, he realized something he had never expected to feel. Ava was beginning to occupy a space in his life that he hadn't foreseen, and that he might no longer be able to control. That intimate moment, marked by confessions and an unexpected connection, left them both with conflicted feelings and a newfound curiosity about what they truly meant to each other. After that night of confessions at the bar, something between Henry and Ava had changed. Henry couldn't stop thinking about what they'd shared, their pains, unspoken dreams, and even the genuine smiles they'd exchanged. Ava felt the difference too, but tried to push these thoughts away. For her, this was still just a contract, something temporary that would soon end. However, no matter how much they resisted, the connection they were building was hard to ignore. In the following weeks, Henry and Ava began seeing each other more often, not only at social events but also in meetings, lunches, and even occasional walks. Ava's kind and relaxed nature gradually softened Henry's cold demeanor. He, who once prided himself on his self-control and distance, now felt an unexpected lightness in her presence. Ava's sincere and often ironic comments started to make him laugh, and he realized that with her, he didn't need to maintain the serious, impenetrable facade. At a lunch with company executives, for example, Ava unceremoniously commented on Henry's excessively formal tie. He, who would usually get annoyed at any critique of his style, simply laughed. "Really? You think it's outdated?" he asked, holding back a smile. "Outdated? I'd say it's a century behind, Henry. I thought CEOs were supposed to be innovative," she replied, winking with a smile. The executives around the table tensed, unsure of how Henry would react, but he surprised them by laughing and even loosening his tie, joking, "Maybe I need a style consultant." Ava laughed, noticing he was genuinely allowing himself to be more relaxed. It was one of the first times she felt Henry was truly letting his guard down. The coldness and arrogance that had always irritated her now seemed less defining of who he was. Beneath the rigid exterior, there was someone she was slowly beginning to know. On another occasion, Henry invited her to his country house in the Hamptons. It was a weekend getaway with a few of Henry's closest friends, a setting far more casual and intimate. Ava was reluctant at first, but with his insistence and curiosity about seeing Henry outside of a corporate setting, she agreed. They arrived in the early afternoon, and Henry seemed more at ease. The house was surrounded by blooming gardens and sprawling lawns that stretched to a private beach. Henry exchanged his usual suit for more casual attire, which initially felt strange to Ava. He looked different, almost like an ordinary person. During the weekend, they grew even closer. Henry took her for a walk on the beach at sunset, and as they walked barefoot in the sand, they talked about old dreams, hobbies they had let go of, and the lightness of life outside of commitments and responsibilities. "You really don't let yourself relax, do you?" Ava asked, smiling as Henry tried, unsuccessfully, to balance a shell on his finger. "I guess relaxing is a word I never quite learned. I always felt I had to do something to earn my place," he confessed, staring out at the sea. Ava watched him, noticing how much he bore the weight of family expectations. To her, Henry seemed trapped in a life he'd never truly chosen. "It's ironic, you know," she said, with a gentle smile of understanding. "You always give me the impression you control everything, but deep down, it seems you don't control anything in your own life." Henry let out a laugh, but there was a hint of sadness in his smile. "Maybe that's why I like being with you, Ava. When I'm with you, it feels like I can let some of those things go." Ava felt an inexplicable warmth from those words. It was a sincere admission, one she'd never expected to hear from Henry. And though she tried to keep her emotions at a distance, she realized their closeness was beginning to affect him in ways neither of them had anticipated. A few days later, Henry showed up unexpectedly at Ava's workplace, suggesting they do something different to take a break from formal events. Without giving details, he took her to a park in Brooklyn, where a small local crafts fair was taking place. Ava was surprised, as this was far from the kind of environment she imagined Henry would frequent. "So, a crafts fair? Who would have thought you had this bohemian side?" Ava remarked, amused. Henry shrugged as if the choice were nothing special. I thought it might be interesting. I always pass by here but never stop to see what they're selling. Ava laughed and pulled Henry toward a ceramic stall, where they began browsing the pieces. She picked up a small vase with colorful paintings and showed it to him. This vase is lovely, don't you think? You should get something like this for your office. It would add a less rigid touch. Henry looked at the vase and, to her surprise, seemed to genuinely consider the idea. Maybe you're right. Something to bring life to the office. Ava laughed, appreciating that he was really loosening up. For the first time, Henry seemed like someone willing to take her suggestions, to try something new. And as they wandered through the fair, stopping at different stalls and sampling foods he normally wouldn't have considered, they both realized how natural and light the moment felt. Henry, usually reserved and distant, was starting to find a lightness in Ava's company that he had never experienced before. Ava, in turn, was seeing more and more of Henry's real human side, a man burdened by responsibilities and expectations since childhood. The arrogance she once despised was starting to fade, revealing a man who was, perhaps, simply lost. That same evening, after their outing, Henry and Ava decided to end the day at his apartment, preparing an improvised dinner together. Cooking together was something entirely out of routine for both, but there was a fun and uncomplicated element in the task that they both enjoyed. Between laughter and confessions, the atmosphere grew increasingly relaxed. As the pasta cooked and the sauce bubbled in the pan, Ava leaned against the counter, crossing her arms as she observed Henry. I never thought I'd see the day Henry Harris would be cooking. You're full of surprises, she joked. Henry laughed, taking the sauce off the stove. Believe it or not, I learned this from my grandmother when I was a kid. When my parents were busy with business, she'd teach me things like this. Ava smiled, taking in this new piece of information about him. Over the past weeks, she'd learned to see beyond the facade Henry had built. He wasn't just a cold, controlling CEO, but someone with a story, a life shaped by a lack of choices and a constant pressure to be perfect. You know, Ava. He began after a moment of silence, his voice softer than usual. I think you're the first person in a long time with whom I feel comfortable. She smiled, touched by his words, though she tried to keep her composure. Maybe you just need to stop worrying so much about what others think, Henry. Sometimes, just being yourself is enough. He looked at her for a moment, as if absorbing every word. The look they exchanged was intense, filled with something neither dared to name. In that moment, Henry felt that Ava's presence did more than just relieve his pressure. She was helping him rediscover himself, to see that there was life beyond obligations. After dinner, they sat on the couch, the conversation flowing naturally, without barriers. For the first time, Ava realized Henry wasn't so different from her. He carried responsibilities, faced pressures, and felt the weight of expectations he'd never chosen. They laughed, reminisced about funny moments, and shared childhood stories. When the night grew late and Ava realized the time, she stood to leave, but hesitated for a moment, sensing that this was different from anything they had shared before. Thank you for today, Henry, she said, smiling. I think you're finally starting to learn how to relax. He returned her smile, feeling an unexpected lightness in his heart. Maybe you're a good influence on me, Ava. She said goodbye, and as she left, Henry felt a restlessness inside. Ava was changing his life in ways he couldn't predict, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't imagine being without her. From that night on, they both knew that the contract they had signed was no longer the center of everything. Something deeper was growing between them, and without realizing it, they were both surrendering to this feeling with a naturalness that surprised them. In the weeks that followed, Henry and Ava continued with their public appearances and events, but their routine had subtly and almost imperceptibly changed. Deep down, both knew something was different, but neither would admit it. Since that night at the bar and the stroll through the artisan fair, a new kind of tension lingered between them, something undefined that even dinners and casual conversations couldn't dispel. Ava, for her part, noticed her mind drifting to Henry more often than she'd like. On days they didn't see each other, she found herself looking at her phone, waiting for a message from him, a new event invitation, an unexpected lunch, or even a casual tease. When she caught herself thinking of him this way, she tried to push those thoughts aside, reminding herself that it was all just a contract, a temporary situation that would eventually end. But increasingly, reason lost strength against the emotions growing within her. Henry, on the other hand, realized that Ava's presence brought something new to his daily life, something he was beginning to fear. He found himself thinking of her in the most unexpected moments during important meetings, while taking the coffee break, or even at the end of a long day when, in the silence of his apartment, he felt something was missing. That absence bothered him more than he wanted to admit. The tension became even more evident at a charity event they attended, organized by one of Harris Group's partner foundations. It was a gala night, and the room was full of influential guests. As always, Ava was stunning, dressed in a navy blue gown that made her look elegant and captivating. Henry couldn't avoid a glance of admiration when she arrived, but he kept his usual neutral expression. During the night, while Henry mingled with some acquaintances, Ava animatedly chatted with a group of people. Among them was a young businessman named Ethan, who seemed enchanted by her every word. Ethan was friendly, charming, and genuinely attentive to Ava, and she, naturally sociable and warm, reciprocated with smiles and laughter. From where he stood, Henry watched their interaction, feeling a rising irritation he struggled, unsuccessfully, to ignore. With every laugh Ava shared, or each time Ethan leaned in to speak with her, Henry felt a prickling sense of discomfort. He tried to focus on the conversations around him, but his gaze kept returning to that scene. Finally, when he noticed Ethan gently touching Ava's arm as he spoke, Henry decided to step in. He approached with a polite smile, but his eyes held something darker. "Ava, may I speak with you for a moment?" he asked, in a tone that left no room for refusal. Ava, surprised by the interruption, nodded and politely excused herself from Ethan, who shot Henry a curious, slightly wary look. When they had moved far enough away, Ava turned to him with an incredulous expression. "What was that about, Henry?" "I was in the middle of a conversation." He crossed his arms, trying to mask his irritation. "I just thought you might be forgetting why we're here." "After all, this isn't exactly a personal party," he replied, trying to keep his tone neutral. Though his irritation was clear, Ava furrowed her brow, noticing the tension in his voice. "And what exactly is that supposed to mean?" she asked, her tone slightly challenging. He looked away, realizing he'd gone too far, but it was hard to back down now. "It means that maybe you should remember we're here representing Harris Group, and your friend seemed a little too interested for something so professional, don't you think?" Ava stared at him, processing what he'd said, and a look of satisfaction crossed her face. "Henry, are you jealous?" He laughed, but the laugh was forced. "Jealous? Don't be ridiculous. I'm only concerned about your conduct, that's all." Ava crossed her arms, keeping her smile. Of course. Concerned about conduct? You forget that I can see right through that mask, Henry. And you know what? Maybe you should get used to the idea that you can't control everything around me." He looked at her for a moment, her response disarming him completely. This woman was an enigma. One moment, she could make his heart race, and the next, make him lose his composure. He opened his mouth to respond, but realized that anything he said would only confirm the jealousy she had suggested. "Let's go," he said finally, in a low tone, trying to end the conversation. As they walked away, the tension between them was palpable, but there was something in the way he gently held her arm, as if wanting to keep her close, that felt different. Ava felt that touch conveyed something beyond the formalities of the contract. In the days following the event, Henry and Ava ended up distancing themselves due to their busy schedules. Ava realized that, in Henry's absence, she felt an inexplicable restlessness. Each time her phone buzzed, Her heart beat faster, and the disappointment was clear when the message wasn't from him. She tried to push those thoughts away, reminding herself it was just a contract. But in the quiet moments of the day, her mind drifted back to him. The laughs they shared, the talks about life, the intimate confessions, all of it felt far more real than she wanted to admit. One afternoon, while at a cafe with her friend Emily, Ava found herself talking about Henry more than usual. Emily, who had known Ava for years, noticed the spark in her eyes when she mentioned his name. "Ava, do you realize how you're talking about him?" Emily asked with a knowing smile. Ava blinked, surprised. "What do you mean?" Emily raised an eyebrow, holding back laughter. "You talk about him as if he's much more than just a contract guy. Maybe it's time you admitted that you like him." Ava shook her head, trying to cover it up. "Emily, that's crazy. There's no way. He's arrogant, bossy, and..." Ava paused, struggling to find more faults. "And he's out of my league. He lives in a world that's not mine." Emily shrugged, smiling. "Maybe he's not as out of reach as you think." Those words stayed with Ava for the rest of the day. The idea that she might be developing feelings for Henry left her feeling confused and even a little scared. She knew that, in the end, this relationship would come to an end. It was a contract, a temporary situation. But the line between fake and real was becoming dangerously thin. Meanwhile, Henry was trying to focus on his business, but he found it hard to push thoughts of Ava away. He felt an increasing frustration with his inability to control these feelings. The image of her laughing with Ethan at the charity event continued to haunt him, and he found himself questioning why it bothered him so much. One evening, while reviewing some documents in his office, Henry finally decided to admit to himself what he'd been trying to deny. He was, indeed, feeling something for Ava, something that went beyond the contract and family obligation. The realization hit him like a shock, a confession he'd never expected to make. He picked up the phone, hesitating for a moment. He knew that by calling her, he was acknowledging, even subtly, the importance she held in his life. But that night, his longing outweighed his pride. "Ava?" he said when she answered. Her voice sounded softer, more comforting than he remembered, and he realized just how much he missed even the way she said his name. "Henry? Is everything okay?" she asked, surprised by the unexpected call. Yes. I just thought maybe we could have dinner tomorrow. It's been a while since we had a quiet night." Ava smiled, feeling a warmth in her chest she preferred to ignore. "I think I can make room in my schedule, Mr. CEO." They laughed, and at that moment, both realized that, no matter how much they denied it, this feeling was growing in a way that was inevitable. The charity dinner that night held special significance for the Harris Group. The foundation hosting the event had been a longtime partner of the company, and the presence of Henry and Ava was eagerly anticipated. Many of the guests were high-profile figures in New York society, and the event, held in a dazzling ballroom adorned with crystal chandeliers and live music, was one of the season's most talked-about affairs. Eager to impress and perhaps still affected by the longing she'd felt for Henry in recent days, Ava chose an elegant red dress with a subtle neckline and a silhouette that flattered her figure. When she entered the ballroom, Henry, waiting near the entrance, couldn't hide his admiration. He was used to seeing her looking beautiful, but tonight she seemed even more captivating. "You look stunning, Ava," he said, unable to mask the light in his eyes. She smiled, slightly embarrassed, but kept her confident demeanor. "And you look quite different tonight, Henry. Almost charming," she replied, joking but with a sincerity he immediately noticed. Henry broke into a genuine smile, and they shared a glance, one of those moments when the world seemed to disappear. He offered his arm to her, and together, with coordinated steps, they moved through the room, greeting guests and acquaintances. Cameras captured their every move, observing the couple who, in everyone's eyes, symbolized the perfect high society romance. The event's atmosphere was formal, but carried a hint of magic and seduction, especially for Henry and Ava, who were growing increasingly aware of each other. They laughed and conversed with guests, playing the role of a couple with surprising naturalness. Yet behind the smiles and glances, a growing tension simmered, something they both tried to disguise, but which became apparent in small gestures, in looks that lingered a moment longer than usual. While mingling with a group of business people and philanthropists, one of the guests asked about their future as a couple, subtly hinting at a possible wedding date. Ava, taken by surprise, smiled, but before she could respond, Henry wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her closer, and smiled with a glint of challenge. "I can assure you, it won't be a long wait," he said, his tone carrying layers of hidden meaning. Ava felt the warmth of Henry's hand on her waist, and a shiver ran through her. She kept her composure, but his gesture disarmed her in ways she hadn't expected. It was the first time Henry held her with such natural intimacy, as if they were truly together. For a moment, it felt like they were acting as a real couple. As the evening continued, Henry kept casting deep glances her way, and the tension between them seemed to grow with each passing minute. They found themselves in an unspoken game, a silent challenge of who would give in first to the magnetic pull between them. Near the end of the dinner, the event's organizer, an old friend of the Harris family, announced a toast for the supporters and guests. Everyone raised their glasses, and Henry and Ava, holding hands, listened to the speech, silent but intensely aware of their shared touch. After the toast, one guest, visibly enthusiastic and perhaps a bit affected by the wine, made a loud comment. "Henry, honor the love of your life with a kiss worthy of it. Come on, let's see this romance in action." The ballroom erupted in applause and encouraging laughter. Ava and Henry exchanged a surprised look, both aware that the crowd's expectation was inevitable. For a moment, they hesitated, but the pressure and the atmosphere propelled them forward. Without thinking much, Henry pulled her closer by the waist, his breath mingling with hers. Ava's heart raced, and before she could fully process what was happening, their lips met. The kiss began softly, almost hesitant, but soon became more intense. They were surrounded by cheers and whistles, yet everything around them seemed to fade away. For both, it felt like this was the first truly intimate moment, their first real contact. Ava felt the warmth of Henry's lips, the press of his hand on her back, and realized that, despite her efforts, she didn't want the moment to end. Henry, for his part, felt her softness and gentleness, something that seemed to break down every barrier he had built. For a brief moment, there was no contract, no pressures or expectations. It was just the two of them, wrapped in an intense, unexpected connection. When the kiss ended, they separated slowly, still caught up in the intensity of the moment. Ava, visibly flushed, looked away, trying to hide the confusion flooding her thoughts. Henry was equally surprised. He hadn't planned or even imagined that the kiss would have such an impact. The applause around them began to die down, and both tried to regain composure, each struggling to appear unaffected. But the looks they exchanged said more than words could. They were both shaken, unable to hide the effect of that simple kiss. "Well, I think our roles are being played quite well," Ava said, attempting to break the tension with a nervous smile. Henry mirrored her smile, but there was something different in his eyes, a sparkle Ava hadn't seen before. "It seems so," he replied, his voice low but filled with emotion. Both knew that this moment hadn't just been part of the act. That kiss had been a manifestation of everything they had been holding back, the realization of feelings that neither of them was ready to acknowledge. After the event ended, Henry insisted on driving Ava back to her apartment, though she tried to mask her nervousness. The drive was marked by a strange silence, as if both were trying to process what had just happened. When they arrived at Ava's building, he turned off the car, but neither made a move to say goodbye. They sat in silence for a few seconds, each trying to understand what that kiss meant. The confusion was evident, yet both were drawn by an inexplicable need to prolong the moment. Finally, Ava broke the silence. "Henry, about what happened back there," she began, but her words were interrupted by Henry's soft expression. "We don't need to talk about it right now," he said gently. "But I want you to know it wasn't just an act for me." Ava held her breath, her heart beating faster. She didn't know how to respond, and for the first time, words felt inadequate to express what she felt. Sensing her hesitation, Henry moved a bit closer, his hand reaching up to touch her face, a light, almost reverent gesture. "I think maybe there's something between us that we didn't expect," he murmured, his intense gaze locked onto hers. Ava took a deep breath, feeling torn between the impulse to run and the desire to stay. Each moment with Henry seemed to chip away at her defenses, and she knew she was treading dangerous ground. "Good night, Henry," she finally said, pulling back and opening the car door. Henry just nodded, but the look he gave her carried an unspoken promise. Watching her exit the car and disappear into her building, he remained there, trying to process the intensity of what he felt. He knew that kiss had changed something between them, something he might no longer be able to control. That night, as Ava tried to sleep, her mind kept returning to the kiss in Henry's gaze. There was something in that moment she couldn't explain, a feeling of completeness and comfort she'd never experienced before. She tossed and turned in bed, trying to rationalize what was happening, but every attempt to convince herself it was just part of the contract felt increasingly untrue. Henry, on the other hand, was equally restless. Sitting in his living room, he tried to focus on anything else, but his mind kept drifting back to the softness of Ava's lips and the way she looked at him after the kiss. He knew he was on dangerous ground, that any emotional involvement wasn't part of their agreement. But it was impossible to deny the growing attraction, the sense that, with her, he could be someone beyond the relentless CEO. Both went to bed that night without answers, but with the certainty that their feelings were irreversibly changing. The kiss had been a turning point, and from then on, nothing would be the same. The morning after the unexpected kiss at the charity event, Ava woke up with a whirlwind of thoughts and a racing heart. Memories of the previous night played over in her mind like scenes from a movie she couldn't pause. She recalled Henry's touch, the intense look he'd given her, the gentle words, and the way he'd held her during the kiss. Still lying in bed, Ava tried to understand how a kiss which had begun as mere pretense could have affected her so deeply. Throughout the day, Ava realized that the kiss had left an imprint on her thoughts and emotions, something that wouldn't disappear no matter how much she tried to ignore it. She caught herself thinking about Henry at random moments, feeling a flush rise to her cheeks when she remembered his intensity. Restless, she tried to rationalize it all, attempting to push away the emotions that had begun to stir. It was just part of the contract, she reminded herself. A scene for the audience. But deep down, she knew that what she'd felt was far more than mere acting. Determined to cope with the confusion, Ava decided that the best way forward was to distance herself from Henry. She needed space, clarity, and, most of all, protection for her heart. She knew that, in the end, their arrangement would expire, and she didn't want to get hurt by something that was never supposed to be real. That week, Ava began declining invitations to lunches and smaller events. One time, when Henry messaged her suggesting a meeting to discuss a new event, she replied with a simple excuse. "Sorry, I'm busy with work today. Let's meet only for the major events." Henry read her response, his expression shifting to a mix of frustration and disappointment. He knew something was off but wasn't sure what. That same night, he tried again, casually suggesting they could discuss upcoming commitments more efficiently over dinner. But Ava, though her heart ached, kept her reply short and distant. Days passed, and Henry, restless, noticed that Ava's absence was affecting him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He spent hours in his office, distracted, reviewing documents without really focusing. The truth was, he missed her in absence that grew uncontrollably. Each meeting or lunch she declined increased his frustration and the feeling that something valuable was slipping through his fingers. Deciding that he had to find a way to see her, Henry devised excuses, unavoidable commitments requiring her presence. He couldn't explain why he was acting this way, but he felt that if he didn't do something, he'd lose the chance to discover what truly existed between them. His first attempt was an invitation to a last-minute event. He called Ava directly, knowing that texts were easier to ignore. "Ava, I need your help at an event on Friday. It's important for the company's image," he said, trying to sound professional but letting a hint of urgency slip into his voice. Ava hesitated for a moment, sensing he was pressing, but without an immediate excuse, she agreed. "Of course, Henry. I'll be there on Friday," she replied, trying to keep her tone indifferent but feeling a surge of emotion. When they arrived at the event on Friday, the tension between them was palpable. Henry greeted her with a soft smile, his gaze meeting hers intensely, as if trying to convey something he couldn't put into words. Ava felt her heart race but tried to remain composed, avoiding his gaze whenever possible. Throughout the evening, as they greeted guests, Henry stayed close, always finding an excuse to be by her side, to touch her lightly on the shoulder, or to guide her with his hand on her back. To anyone else, these gestures might have seemed casual, but to them, they were filled with meaning. Every touch, every look intensified what they were both trying to conceal. After a brief conversation with some guests, Ava moved to get a drink, trying to catch her breath and relieve the pressure she felt around Henry. He watched her, noticing her attempt to pull away, and decided to follow. "Are you okay?" he asked, approaching her, his voice low and soft amid the music and the surrounding buzz. She looked at him for a moment, feeling his penetrating gaze. It was increasingly difficult to hide her attraction, but she was determined not to give in. "Yes, Henry, everything's fine," she replied, trying to sound casual. "I just thought we could use a little space to keep things from getting too complicated." He frowned, confused and slightly hurt. "Space? Since when do we need space, Ava?" She looked away, trying to stay resolute. "Since this." She hesitated, searching for the right words, since what we're doing started to feel too real. Henry remained silent for a moment, processing what she'd said. He knew exactly what she meant. He too felt the line between pretense and reality blurring more and more. But unlike her, he didn't want to back away. For the first time, Henry felt something genuine and good emerging in his life, something he wasn't ready to lose. "Maybe, Ava, maybe it's not just an act," he said, his voice filled with suppressed emotion. "Maybe there's something here worth exploring." Ava took a deep breath, trying not to let herself be swayed. "Henry, this is a contract, a temporary situation, and you know that." He looked at her, his expression a blend of sadness and determination. "I know, but that doesn't mean what I feel is temporary." Before she could respond, a group of guests called them over, interrupting their conversation. Ava felt a mixture of relief and frustration. It was easier to avoid the situation, but part of her longed to continue. Henry's presence was magnetic, and fighting the attraction was becoming a burden. After the event, Henry decided he wouldn't give up. The next day, he sent another message to Ava, suggesting a business lunch to discuss future strategies, a transparent excuse that Ava, deep down, accepted with growing curiosity. They met at an upscale restaurant, and over the course of the meal, Henry tried to keep the conversation professional but ended up steering it toward more personal topics. With every smile she gave, every glance they exchanged, he felt himself drawn in deeper. Yet, Ava remained somewhat distant, trying to keep her heart from overruling her mind. At the end of the lunch, as Henry walked her to the exit, he gently held her arm. "Ava, please," he said, his voice laced with sincerity. "I know you're trying to keep your distance, but I think we need to be honest with each other. This arrangement, this pretense, it's not just an act for me anymore." She stayed silent, feeling the intensity of his gaze, yet still fought against the temptation to admit her own feelings. Ava knew she was standing on the edge of a precipice, and giving in meant opening her heart to something that could deeply hurt her. "Henry, you know that what we have is temporary," she finally replied, her tone gentle but firm. And in the end, we'll each go our separate ways." Henry sighed, frustrated by her response, but knew pressing further wouldn't help. He felt he needed to show her, slowly, that what they shared was real, that this feeling consuming him wasn't fleeting. That night, alone in her apartment, Ava felt the fragility of her own defenses. Every word from Henry echoed in her mind, and she wondered how long she could keep resisting. Her logic insisted that staying away was best, keeping things within the contract's boundaries. But her heart urged her, more and more, to yield, to take a risk. After all, each time she was near him, the world around them seemed to disappear, and each time she tried to resist, the feeling only grew. Ava knew she was facing a difficult choice, and no matter how much she tried to avoid it, she knew she would eventually have to choose between the safety of distance and the possibility of opening her heart to something unexpected and intense. As the city lights flickered outside her window, Ava realized that the game between her and Henry had long since stopped being a mere performance. They were both deeply involved, and no matter how much they tried to resist, their hearts insisted on following their own paths, bringing emotions to the surface that no contract could control. That week, Henry had no idea that a piece of his past was about to resurface, complicating the tangled web of emotions between him and Ava even further. One busy afternoon at the office, he was caught off guard by the sudden arrival of Catherine Maxwell, his ex-girlfriend and a prominent figure in New York City's elite circles. Catherine entered the room with her usual poised confidence, dressed immaculately and exuding an air of control as if she belonged there. Catherine and Henry shared a long history. She was the daughter of one of Harris Group's partners and had for a time been seen as Henry's perfect match. Intelligent, sophisticated, and ambitious, Catherine seemed to have everything that aligned with Henry's life. They had broken up over a year ago, but due to shared social circles and business ties, they had never completely drifted apart. Henry looked up as he heard the door open, and his surprise was apparent when he saw Catherine standing there, smiling with a familiarity that he hadn't expected. "Catherine," he said, masking his surprise as best he could. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." She tilted her head playfully, that signature confident smile lighting up her face. "I thought a surprise visit would be nice. I was in the city and figured I'd stop by and say hello," she replied, setting her luxurious leather bag on Henry's desk. "It's been a while since we caught up, don't you think?" Henry gestured for her to take a seat as she observed him, her gaze lingering with a touch of nostalgia and perhaps something more. During their conversation, Catherine casually mentioned changes in her career, new investments, and memories of the days they spent together in the same high society events and circles. "Henry, we should do something together again," she suggested with a smile. "I miss the two of us in those events. We were quite the formidable pair." Henry gave a slight smile but avoided her gaze, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Deep down, he knew what Catherine was hinting at, yet he also knew that something fundamental within him had changed. There was someone else occupying his thoughts now. But Catherine, sensing his hesitation, wasn't one to accept defeat easily. That very evening, Henry received a message from her inviting him to a casual dinner, just to catch up. Without much thought, he agreed, assuming it would be a simple and uncomplicated meeting. However, when he arrived at the restaurant, it became clear Catherine had other intentions. Throughout dinner, Catherine threw suggestive glances, reminisced about their time together, and talked about ambitions and goals they once shared. She was straightforward, admitting she missed him and hinting that perhaps there could be another chance for them. Henry maintained his composure, responding politely, but a bothersome question lingered in the back of his mind. Catherine was part of a past he knew well, a partnership that, on paper, seemed to make sense. But even as she spoke, images of Ava kept intruding, stirring both discomfort and a nagging sense of comparison that he couldn't dismiss. In the days that followed, Catherine began appearing at more events and visiting places where she knew Henry would be. During one of these events, Catherine ran into Henry and Ava. Already uncomfortable with Catherine's focused attention on Henry, Ava did her best to remain polite, though Catherine soon made things even more awkward. "Oh, you must be Ava," Catherine said with a courteous smile that held a hint of condescension. "I've heard so much about you." Ava smiled politely, though she felt the tension in the air. "Pleasure to meet you, Catherine," she replied, trying to keep her tone formal. Catherine gave Ava a scrutinizing look, her enigmatic smile revealing little. Yet something in Catherine's eyes disturbed Ava deeply. It was as if Catherine saw her as a fleeting presence, something temporary. After a brief introduction, Catherine turned her attention fully to Henry, pointedly ignoring Ava's presence as she launched into stories of past events, shared vacations, and mutual acquaintances. Standing beside them, Ava struggled to hide her growing discomfort. Each time Catherine smiled at Henry or made a nostalgic comment, Ava felt a pang of insecurity mixed with irritation. She knew Catherine had been an important part of Henry's life, someone who shared a history she knew nothing about. The thought that Catherine might be trying to win him back seemed absurd, but the unease remained. Noticing Ava's silence and the tension in her expression, Henry attempted to include her in the conversation. However, Catherine deftly steered the focus away from Ava, making the situation increasingly uncomfortable. Usually poised in any circumstance, Ava found herself feeling out of place. She was there to play the role of Henry's fiancée, yet something in Catherine's behavior seemed to challenge her position without subtlety. That night, after the event, Henry and Ava walked out together, and he noticed she was quieter than usual. They walked in silence for a few moments until Henry finally broke the silence. "Ava, is everything okay?" he asked, studying her expression. She took a deep breath, carefully choosing her words. "Yes, it's just that I didn't know your ex was back in town, and that she'd be so interested in catching up with you." Henry raised his eyebrows, surprised by the tone of her voice. He hesitated, but realized he owed her an explanation. Catherine showed up unexpectedly. "She is part of my past, but she doesn't mean anything to me now." Ava felt a mixture of relief and disbelief, but chose not to press the issue. She knew Henry was being sincere, but Catherine's presence still left a discomfort she couldn't shake. "All right, Henry, I just would have liked a heads up." Ava kept her tone steady, but a small shadow of insecurity lingered. Henry felt the distance growing between them again, a distance that Catherine had perhaps unknowingly widened. He felt frustrated with the situation and for the first time wished things between him and Ava were clearer, without the contract's boundaries and the rules that separated them. In the following days, Catherine didn't relent. She frequently called Henry, sent messages filled with nostalgic reminders, and suggested dinners and meetups. Although he responded with detached professionalism, Ava couldn't help noticing the frequent exchanges. As much as she tried, she couldn't hide her discomfort. Doubts and uncertainty began creeping into her heart. What if Catherine represented the security that Henry secretly wanted? What if deep down he still had feelings for his ex? One evening, Henry resolved to talk to Ava and clarify his feelings. He knew that, no matter how persistent Catherine was, she wasn't the one he truly wanted to be with. Ava was the one he thought about, the one who made his heart beat faster, the one who brought him genuine happiness. Henry invited her to dinner, and as they sat across from each other, he found it hard to start the conversation. He wanted to explain that Catherine was in the past, that it was Ava he wanted, but the words didn't come out as he'd hoped. Sensing his hesitation, Ava misinterpreted the silence as doubt. A pang of unfamiliar pain hit her chest, and for the first time, she felt vulnerable around Henry. When dinner ended, both of them looked weary, but neither wanted to end the night without the conversation they both knew needed to happen. Standing outside the restaurant as the city night descended, Ava gathered the courage to ask what she feared most. "Henry, be honest. Do you still feel something for Catherine?" Her question caught Henry off guard, and he took a moment longer to answer than he'd intended. He realized her insecurity was a reflection of his own vulnerability. the fear that his feelings for her were leaving him exposed. "Ava, Catherine is part of a past that doesn't matter anymore. She's a memory. But you're the present," he said, his gaze intensely fixed on hers. Ava felt her heart race, but before she could respond, Henry took her hand. "I know this all started as an arrangement, but deep down, I think we both know it's more than that. Catherine doesn't mean anything now because, honestly, I can only think about you." Those words brought out everything Ava had been afraid to admit. She knew she was falling for Henry, and hearing him say it confirmed that she meant something important to him, too. Both of them smiled, the doubts and insecurities seeming to dissolve into the night, yet with the understanding that their relationship was only just beginning to feel real, intense, and genuine. In the days following their dinner, Henry and Ava's relationship continued to deepen in subtle yet undeniable ways. Now, when they looked at each other, there was a softness, a sincerity that hadn't been there before, and even the most mundane conversations carried a new weight. However, a shadow loomed over them. Catherine, who seemed determined to remain a part of Henry's life, and more importantly, a disruptive presence in Ava's. Catherine was relentless in her attempts to win Henry back, employing no subtlety in her approach. She made it a point to attend any events she knew they'd be at, often casting lingering, suggestive looks at Henry whenever she was near. If given the chance, she'd pull him aside to reminisce about their time together, as if to remind him and Ava of the connection they once shared. As much as Ava tried to ignore it, Catherine's presence unsettled her. The confidence she felt with Henry wavered each time Catherine appeared, and despite his reassurances, seeing them together stirred emotions she could barely acknowledge. She didn't want to admit it, not even to herself, but the jealousy simmered beneath the surface, threatening to upend her calm. One evening, at an exclusive Harris Group event held in a luxurious ballroom filled with New York's elite, Catherine approached Henry and Ava as they were talking with a few colleagues. She wore a sleek black dress and carried herself with her characteristic poise, which only underscored her self-assurance. With a calculated smile, she joined their group as though she didn't notice Ava's presence, though it was obvious she wanted to be the center of attention. "Henry, darling, it was lovely seeing you last week at that dinner," Catherine said, casually brushing her hand against his arm. "Such a shame we couldn't catch up more. We have so many memories to revisit, don't we?" Ava forced a polite smile, but Catherine's tone and the deliberate touch made her chest tighten. She knew Catherine was baiting her, turning this into a subtle game, but seeing the interaction between Henry and his ex still affected her. Sensing Ava's discomfort, Henry subtly distanced himself, his expression cool and reserved. "Yes, Catherine, but as you know, my schedule is quite full now," he replied, giving Ava a reassuring glance, hoping to ease her mind. Catherine glanced at Ava with a faint, dismissive smile. "Oh, of course. I imagine spending time with Ava must also take up quite a bit of your time, doesn't it, Henry?" she asked, her tone laced with insinuation. Ava held her smile, but Catherine's words seemed deliberately chosen to remind her that, in many eyes, she was seen as merely a temporary fixture in Henry's life. Determined not to give in to the provocations, Ava responded firmly. "Yes, we've been very busy, Catherine, but I think that's what makes us complementary, wouldn't you agree?" Catherine raised an eyebrow, clearly unsettled by Ava's reply. She smiled, though the tension between them was palpable, and the silent rivalry wasn't lost on Henry. He found himself caught between the desire to defend Ava and the need to avoid causing a scene. Yet, it seemed Catherine had only just begun. In the following days, Catherine's persistence only grew. She found excuses to call Henry, sent messages asking about Harris Group projects, and offered her help at meetings and events, always making it clear she was available and eager to spend more time with him. Each message unsettled Henry further, as he knew Catherine wasn't truly interested in business matters but rather intent on provoking Ava and attempting to reclaim a place in his life that no longer existed. For Ava, the situation was becoming unbearable. Although Henry had made his feelings clear, Catherine's constant presence was beginning to erode her confidence. One weekend, while she and Henry attended a smaller gathering, Catherine showed up once again coincidentally and made it a point to approach them with subtle yet provocative remarks. "So Ava, you're getting to know the Harris family well by now, aren't you? Or are you still adjusting to our world?" Catherine asked with a polite smile, laced with obvious condescension. Ava gripped her glass more firmly, feeling her face heat up. But before she could respond, Henry intervened, unable to contain his irritation. "Catherine, I think I've made it clear that I'm with Ava now. Perhaps it's time for you to remember we're in different worlds now," he said, his tone cold and resolute. Catherine's surprise was evident. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially by Henry. However, rather than backing down, she flashed a defiant smile. "Oh, of course, Henry. But sometimes the past is a funny way of resurfacing," she said, casting a final look at Ava before walking away. Ava tried to brush off the comment, but Catherine's words struck a nerve. Her heart raced, and a mix of anger and insecurity bubbled up. She knew she should trust Henry, but Catherine's provocations were stirring up doubts she hadn't even known she harbored. Later that night, after leaving the event, Henry noticed Ava's uncharacteristic silence. She seemed lost in thought, and when they reached her apartment, he parked but noticed she was still staring ahead, visibly troubled. "Ava, is everything okay?" he asked, concerned. She took a deep breath, searching for the right words. "It's just that I don't understand why Catherine keeps pushing. She seems so sure there's still something between you two. And I don't know what to think, Henry." He turned to face her, feeling a mixture of guilt and urgency to reassure her. He gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, his gaze filled with sincerity. "Ava, Catherine is in the past. I know what she's doing is unsettling, but I'm here with you, and that's what matters to me. You matter to me." Henry's words were heartfelt, and Ava felt warmth spread through her chest, yet her fears and insecurities lingered. "It's just that. She keeps reminding me how important you two once were to each other, and I'm not sure I can compete with a history like that." Henry sighed, realizing that Catherine's interference had planted doubts he had never wanted Ava to feel. "Ava, listen," he said, holding her hand. "I don't want Catherine. What I feel for you is something I never had with her. With you, I feel like I can truly be myself. And I know this is real, something genuine." Tears pricked at Ava's eyes as she smiled, touched by his words. She knew Henry was being honest, and that despite her insecurities and Catherine's provocations, what they shared was undeniable. She took a deep breath, determined to let go of her jealousy and focus on what truly mattered: the fact that they were together, in spite of everything. Sensing her vulnerability, Henry leaned in and kissed her softly, a kiss filled with warmth and sincerity. In that moment, everything felt right, and Ava's insecurities faded, replaced by the warmth of his touch and the certainty that they were moving forward together. In the days that followed, Catherine continued her attempts to provoke Ava, but Henry remained steadfast, making it clear to everyone, including Catherine, that Ava was his priority. And Ava, for her part, began to see Catherine as nothing more than a shadow of the past, something that couldn't undermine the truth of what she and Henry shared. As time passed, Catherine's provocations lost their power, and Ava realized that, with Henry by her side, she'd found not just love but a partnership strong enough to withstand any test or insecurity. It was a cold, rainy morning in New York, and Ava left her building in a hurry, trying to balance her umbrella and bag while checking her phone. She was running late for a meeting and sensed the day would be one of those challenging ones from the start. Just as she stepped onto the slick sidewalk, she lost her footing on a slippery spot. Before she could react, she fell, twisting her ankle as she hit the ground. The pain was immediate and intense, radiating up her leg. Concerned pedestrians stopped to help, and a kind passerby called an ambulance, noticing the distress on her face. Shortly after, she was taken to the hospital, where the doctor diagnosed her with a severe ankle sprain. She was advised to stay off her feet for several days to ensure full recovery, which left Ava feeling frustrated. She knew she'd have to cancel important plans and adapt to this new unwanted limitation. As she lay in the hospital, someone suggested she contact a loved one. Ava hesitated. She knew Henry would be concerned, but she didn't want to burden him. Yet, as she thought it over, she realized he might feel hurt if he found out about her accident from someone else. Taking a breath, she typed out a message and sent it with a bit of reluctance. "Hey Henry, it's nothing serious, but I'm at the hospital. Had a little accident. I'll be fine." Henry's reply was immediate, and he called her within seconds. His voice carried a sense of urgency and a hint of worry that caught her off guard. "Ava, where are you? What happened?" he asked, his voice barely hiding his anxiety. She tried to reassure him, but he insisted on coming to the hospital. In less than 30 minutes, Henry appeared at the entrance of the examination room, a look of deep concern on his face that Ava never expected to see. Dressed in his usual suit, with slightly disheveled hair from rushing, he went straight to her, holding her hand firmly. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked, his voice a mix of frustration and relief. "I would have been here right away." Ava laughed, trying to lighten the mood. "I didn't want to worry you, Henry. It's just a sprain. The doctor says I'll be fine with a few days of rest." Henry exhaled, but his gaze held a depth she hadn't seen before. He stayed by her side as they waited for the final test results, his presence bringing Ava an unexpected sense of calm. Every time he gently squeezed her hand, she felt a connection between them, a quiet bond that didn't need words. Once the doctor confirmed she could go home, Henry took charge of getting her there. He carefully helped her to her feet, and despite her attempts to protest, he supported her firmly, guiding her to the car and opening the door, helping her in with utmost care. The ride to her apartment was filled with comfortable silence, charged with unspoken emotions. Henry kept glancing at her, ensuring she was okay and didn't need anything. When they arrived, Henry, without waiting for permission, helped her up to her apartment, arranging pillows and a blanket to make her comfortable on the couch. Ava tried to insist he didn't have to go to such lengths, but he only smiled, adjusting everything around her to make sure she lacked nothing. "Is that better?" he asked, finally, after setting everything up. Ava nodded, touched by his attention. There was something in Henry's gaze that felt different. She sensed he was closer, more open, and this level of care made her feel incredibly special. "Thank you, Henry. I didn't expect you to drop everything to be here. It really means a lot to me," she said, her voice soft and sincere. He only smiled, but the warmth in his eyes revealed that her words had struck something deep within him. In the days that followed, Henry made it a point to check in on her whenever he could. He stopped by each morning, leaving coffee and snacks for her, and returned at night to make sure she was okay. At first, Ava protested, telling him he didn't need to go to such lengths, but she quickly realized how much his daily visits brightened her day. On the third night, he showed up with a bag of groceries, entering her apartment as if it were already a part of his routine. Ava, lounging on the couch, watched with a smile as he unloaded the bag, pulling out fresh ingredients and a bottle of wine. "I've decided I'm cooking tonight," he announced with a confident smile, as though revealing a hidden talent. Ava laughed, delighted and surprised by the scene. "You know how to cook?" "I never imagined the CEO would risk himself in the kitchen," she teased. He chuckled, uncorking the wine and pouring them each a glass. "Well, I won't claim to be a chef, but I can make something decent," he said, handing her a glass and toasting with her. As he cooked, Ava watched him, feeling a deep sense of peace. This man, who had once seemed so distant and untouchable, was now in her kitchen, preparing a meal with care and intention. Watching Henry like this relaxed and at ease made her realize just how much he'd changed, and more importantly, how much he meant to her. When they finally sat down to dinner, the atmosphere was light and easy. They talked about simple things, laughed at stories, and reminisced about the funny moments from the first events they attended together. The nervousness they'd felt in the beginning of their arrangement was long gone. Here, there was no contract, no obligations. It was simply Henry and Ava, two people allowing themselves to feel something they had been afraid of. After dinner, Henry helped her back to the couch, holding her hand as they watched a movie together. Ava realized that his presence beside her was more comforting than anything else. Every time he looked at her or smiled, a warmth spread through her, and she knew that, despite her reluctance, she was falling in love. A few nights later, after another visit from Henry, he was helping her settle back onto the couch when Ava, feeling vulnerable but emboldened, decided to ask a question that had been on her mind. "Henry, why are you doing all this for me?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with expectation. He looked into her eyes, hesitating for a moment. But there was something in his gaze, something that finally seemed ready to be spoken. "Because you're important to me, Ava. More than I can say," he confessed, his tone sincere and tinged with emotion. "When I heard about your accident, I realized how much the thought of losing you scared me. I can't pretend anymore that what I feel for you is just part of this arrangement." Ava's heart beat faster at his words, and a wave of emotion washed over her. In that moment, she knew he felt the same. They sat in silence, their eyes locked, saying more than words ever could. Slowly, Henry leaned in, cradling her face gently as he kissed her, a kiss that confirmed everything they had been denying. The kiss was full of tenderness, warmth, and a truth they had both hidden for so long. When they finally pulled away, Ava smiled, and Henry, still holding her, smiled back as though they had both finally found what they had been searching for. They knew that from that moment on, things would change, but they were ready to face it all together. That night, after their kiss, Henry and Ava remained side by side, both still feeling the impact of the moment. They knew that crossing that line had dismantled the boundaries they'd once relied on to keep their relationship within the terms of the contract. There was no longer any pretending that they were just two strangers tied by an agreement. The feelings that had grown between them were deeper and undeniably real. Henry looked at her for a long moment, as if he were memorizing every detail of her face. There was a tenderness in his gaze that Ava had never seen before, and she felt her heartbeat quicken, as if every unspoken word now hung heavily in the air between them. "Ava," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "I think. I'm certain that what I feel for you is so much more than I was willing to admit. Since we started this, whatever this is, something changed in me. And now I can't deny how much you mean to me." Henry's words were sincere, and for the first time, he allowed himself to open up, letting her see his vulnerabilities. Ava, meeting his gaze, felt the weight of the contract dissolve in that moment. All the feelings she had kept hidden, all her hesitations and insecurities, seemed to lose their grip in the face of his honesty. She took a deep breath, resisting the urge to hold back her own emotions. "Henry, I feel the same," she admitted, her voice both hesitant and determined. "I think I fought it so hard because, deep down, I was afraid. Afraid of getting attached, of getting hurt, of believing this was real." Henry held her hands, his thumbs gently tracing circles on her skin as he listened intently. His expression was calm, yet his eyes radiated an intensity that made it clear just how much her words meant to him. "I understand, Ava," he murmured, his tone comforting. "I was afraid too, I won't lie. I built a life of control and certainty, but with you, for the first time, none of it makes sense anymore." Ava felt her eyes well up with tears, moved by his sincerity. Through everything they had been through, from their initial tense meetings to the moment he'd supported her after the accident, Ava realized Henry had become a part of her in a way she'd never imagined. Being beside him, knowing him so closely, allowed her to see beyond the serious, determined man everyone else saw. She saw someone who, at his core, longed for the same thing she did, a true connection. "So, what do we do now?" she asked, laughing softly, nervousness apparent in her expression. Henry chuckled, but his face showed determination. "Let's leave this contract behind," he said, his gaze steady and resolute. "I want to be with you, Ava, without limitations, without the pressure of an agreement. I don't want this to be something temporary. I want it to be real." Ava looked at him, letting each word sink in. The contract that had once been a shield of security, protecting them from emotional involvement, now seemed insignificant. She knew that by taking a chance on these feelings, she was risking her heart, but she was also following something that made it beat stronger. "I want that too, Henry," she whispered, almost as if to herself. "I want us to stop pretending, to let ourselves discover who we really are together." He smiled, and in that moment, they seemed to draw even closer, as if an invisible weight had been lifted from their shoulders. Still holding her hands, Henry pulled her toward him, and they sat there in silence, simply gazing at each other. The connection they felt was stronger than any words, more genuine than any contract. In that moment, both knew that, no matter the obstacles, they were willing to face whatever lay ahead. In the days that followed, Henry and Ava's relationship transformed completely. They spent more time together, but now without the obligation to appear as the perfect couple in front of others. Little by little, the exchanged glances and smiles became more frequent, their meetings more intimate and natural. Conversations that had once been filled with tension and defenses now flowed with a sincerity they both deeply cherished. One weekend, Henry invited Ava to spend the day at his country house in the Hamptons. He wanted her to see more of his world, to know a side of him that few people had the chance to witness. Ava accepted with enthusiasm, feeling freer to share genuine moments with him. Upon arrival, the country house was exactly as Ava had imagined, spacious, with large windows allowing natural light to pour in, surrounded by meticulously kept gardens and offering a breathtaking view of the sea. She was captivated by the place, but what surprised her most was its simplicity and comfort. Henry, whom she had always imagined as rigid and formal, now revealed a warm, relaxed side that drew her even closer. At the end of the afternoon, after a long walk along the beach, they sat on the porch with glasses of wine, watching the sunset. Ava lay her head on his shoulder, and Henry wrapped his arm around her, their closeness feeling as natural as breathing. With each passing minute, he felt her presence filling a space within him that once seemed empty. "Did you know, before you came into my life, I thought my future was already set in stone," he said, breaking the silence. "I thought I knew exactly how everything would go, and the idea of changing anything was almost terrifying." Ava looked up at him, smiling softly. "And now, are you still afraid of change?" she asked, curious. Henry gazed at her, his eyes full of affection and sincerity. "Now with you, I realize that change might be the best thing that's ever happened to me." He paused, holding her hand. "Ava, you've taught me to see things differently. I never knew I could feel so at ease with someone, and it makes me want to be with you every day." Ava's heart raced. His words, filled with truth, were everything she hadn't known she wanted to hear. Smiling, she intertwined her fingers with his and whispered, "You've changed me too, Henry. I always thought I had to take the safe path to avoid risks. But now I see that being with you makes me want to risk it all." They kissed again, a sweet, meaningful kiss, a silent promise that they were ready for whatever came next. There were no more doubts or uncertainties. What they had was real, and they both knew they were ready to face the world together without holding back. After that weekend, their relationship only grew stronger, and they became inseparable. At company events, Henry proudly stood by Ava's side, holding her hand or wrapping an arm around her waist, as if telling the world she was part of his life. Ava, who had once felt insecure and out of place, now felt at home beside him, knowing she held an important place in Henry's life. As the weeks went by, what had once been an agreement between them blossomed into a true romance, built on trust, care, and a connection no one else could understand. They shared not only joyful moments, but also life's pressures and challenges, supporting each other and facing every obstacle together. Over time, Henry opened up even more, talking about his frustrations and family pressures, and Ava always listened with patience and empathy. For him, it was a relief to know he could be completely honest with her, without having to hide or maintain a facade of perfection. And for Ava, seeing Henry's most human side, vulnerable and real, only made her fall for him more deeply. When the contract finally came to an end, Henry realized it was the most insignificant thing of everything they'd experienced together. He didn't need a piece of paper to secure her place at his side. He knew, without a doubt, that she was the person he wanted to be with every day. That night, as he burned the old contract, Henry held her close, looking into her eyes with a sincere smile. "I never thought I'd say this, but maybe the most important deal I ever made was the one that brought me to you." Ava laughed, touched, and hugged him tightly. "And I never thought a contract could lead me to someone like you." The contract had ended, but for Henry and Ava, it was just the beginning. The relationship between Henry and Ava, now grounded in genuine affection without the need for contracts or formalities, soon faced unexpected challenges. The Harris Group, the cornerstone of Henry's ambitions, was going through a delicate phase, and the familial pressures he thought he had under control began to resurface, intensifying with each day. One morning, Henry arrived at the office to find his uncle, Robert, waiting for him in the conference room. Robert was a hard-nosed businessman with high expectations for Henry and an unyielding approach to the company's interests. His expression showed a familiar disapproval as he waited for Henry to approach, ready to speak. "We need to talk about your image and the way the board is perceiving certain changes in your personal life," Robert began, with a piercing look. "This relationship with Ava is attracting too much attention, and not the right kind." Henry's face darkened, though he maintained a calm tone. "Robert, I don't see how my personal life interferes with my ability to lead this company. Since Ava and I began our relationship, there's been no negative impact on our performance." Robert sighed, folding his arms. "You might not see it, but the board does. They're questioning whether you're still fully committed to the Harris Group. Don't you think this relationship is a distraction from your responsibilities? The state of the company demands your complete focus, and certain novelties in your life are being viewed as unnecessary distractions." Henry felt his blood boil. Deep down, he knew his uncle saw Ava as a destabilizing force, someone outside the family's trusted circle. Robert's cold tone when referring to her disturbed him, but he knew he had to stay composed. "Robert, Ava is an important part of my life now. And honestly, I've proven my commitment countless times. If the board wants results, they'll have them. But that doesn't mean I have to give up on something this meaningful to me." Robert looked at him in silence, his face remaining impassive. "The company is on the brink of a new phase. This is a critical moment, Henry. We need to be sure you're fully focused. The board expects you to consider all the implications of your choices. And as you well know, expectations are high." With that, Robert stood up, leaving Henry alone in the conference room. Henry sat in silence for a moment, absorbing his uncle's words and feeling the weight of the pressure piling on his shoulders. He knew what he and Ava had was real, something he didn't want to give up. But he also understood what the company expected of him, especially at such a pivotal time. Later that evening, when he met Ava for dinner, Henry was distracted, lost in thought. She noticed his tense expression and, with a worried smile, took his hand across the table. "Henry, is everything okay?" she asked, her gaze filled with love and concern. He looked at her, debating how much to share. But he knew he had to be honest. "It's the company, Ava. They're demanding more of me than ever, and it seems they're not handling my relationship with you well. My uncle Robert mentioned that the board is questioning whether I'm really focused. And I hate to say this, but what we're building together is being seen as a distraction to them." Ava felt her chest tighten at his words. She knew the Harris Group had always been a priority for Henry and understood the complex, demanding nature of his family's expectations. Trying to stay calm, she squeezed his hand with a reassuring smile. "Henry, I understand how important the Harris Group is to you. I would never want to be an obstacle to your career. But I want you to know that I'm here to support you. And if that means facing these challenges together, I'm ready to stand by your side." He looked at her with gratitude, amazed at how gracefully she was handling the situation. But he felt an internal conflict brewing. The last thing he wanted was to see her under pressure or to make her feel guilty about his dedication to the company. In the following days, Henry did his best to divide his time between the company and Ava, but the situation at the office only worsened. Shareholders were pressing for rapid, decisive changes, and each meeting seemed to bring more doubts about his leadership. His grandfather, though more understanding, was also feeling the board's pressure to see Henry demonstrate absolute commitment to the company. One night, after an especially tense board meeting, Henry arrived at Ava's apartment, exhausted and carrying an expression she recognized as discouragement. She welcomed him with a silent embrace, sensing that he needed support more than words. "Henry, I'm here. No matter what," she murmured, gently stroking his face. He held her close, realizing that this gesture was the only thing calming him at that moment. He looked into her eyes, and in that instant, he understood just how much he needed her to stay grounded. "Ava, I just wish things were easier. I want to be with you, but the pressures from the company are becoming unbearable. My grandfather, my uncle, the board. They all expect me to put the company above everything else." She nodded, understanding his position but feeling a subtle ache in her heart. She knew their love was real, but she also understood that Henry's family and professional obligations would always be a part of his life. "I know your career matters to you, Henry, and I know how hard you've worked to get here. I don't want you to feel torn between us. I'm ready to face this with you, but I can only do that if you really want me by your side." He cupped her face, his expression full of sincerity. "Ava, I want this more than anything. I won't let external pressures drive us apart. You're the most important person in my life now. I just need time to figure out how to balance everything." She smiled, reassured by his words, and kissed him tenderly, showing that she was willing to support whatever he decided. The following weeks were an emotional roller coaster for them. Henry became increasingly immersed in work, while Ava tried to be understanding, but their time together was growing scarce. Every time he returned late from a meeting or postponed plans with her, Ava felt the weight of their relationship and the life they were leading. One of those nights, after a string of late meetings, Henry arrived at Ava's apartment to find her ready for bed with a worried expression. He sighed, knowing this was another moment where she had been left waiting. And before he could say anything, Ava spoke up. "Henry, I understand your responsibilities, but I can't ignore how this is pulling us apart. Every time I see you come back exhausted, every time I feel you're being pressured to choose between the company and us, I get scared. Scared that one day, this might be too much for us." He felt the weight of her words, but knew he had to be honest. "I know, Ava, and I won't lie, maintaining this balance is harder than I imagined, but I'm trying. I'm trying to make this work without making you feel like a burden, because you're not." She took a deep breath, holding his hands. "Henry, I need to know we're in this together. That no matter how hard it gets, you're willing to fight for this, because I am." He pulled her close, embracing her tightly, as though he feared losing her. He knew the pressures were immense, and balancing the love he had for her with his family and business obligations was challenging. But at that moment, he decided that Ava was a priority he couldn't ignore. "I'm with you, Ava. No matter what, I'm here. We'll find a way to make this work, I promise." That night, as they fell asleep together, Henry felt, for the first time, a clear sense of what he truly wanted. He knew it would be a struggle, that the family and company pressures wouldn't vanish overnight, but he was committed to making sure Ava felt like a genuine part of his life, a part he would never abandon. At dawn, as he looked at Ava, still asleep beside him. Henry knew that the road they were on would be difficult, but gazing at her peaceful face, he understood that, despite the obstacles, the choice he made for her was the truest one of all. And for her, he was willing to face it all. Ava sat alone in her apartment, gazing at the distant lights of New York City flickering against the night. Over the past few days, a lingering sense of displacement beside Henry had taken root and grown into a bittersweet certainty. Despite how deeply she loved him, Ava couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong in his world. The love they shared was genuine and profound, yet the pressures he faced within the Harris Group made her feel as though she might be hindering his path forward rather than supporting it. Thoughts swirled in her mind. She recalled Henry's tense conversations with family members, the scrutinizing gaze of his Uncle Robert and the board, members who regarded her as an outsider or distraction for the Harris Group's heir. She carried an invisible weight every time they were together, a subtle, constant reminder of her inadequacy in Henry's world. For months, they had fought to build something real. They had overcome the initial barriers, dealt with doubt, jealousy, and family pressure. But every time it seemed they were ready to move forward together, another challenge emerged. Deep down, Ava feared that staying in the relationship might ultimately harm the man she loved. Consumed by these thoughts, Ava knew she had to make a difficult choice. That night, she poured her heart into a letter for Henry, expressing the love she felt for him, but also the pain of realizing that, despite her best efforts, she couldn't meet the expectations that came with his world. She wanted him to be free to pursue his role at the Harris Group without the burden of a life that clashed with his own. By letting him go, she believed she could offer him the freedom he deserved. The following morning, Ava sent the letter and began to pack some of her belongings. She decided to leave New York for a while, to find herself again and, perhaps, rebuild her life without Henry's constant presence in her thoughts. When Henry received the letter, he was in his office. The day had started like any other, filled with meetings and responsibilities, but the sight of an envelope bearing her name made his heart race. As he opened it and read her words, a wave of desperation washed over him. "Henry, you're the man who changed my life, but you also showed me that love is not always easy. I love you deeply, but I see now that maybe I don't belong in your world. I don't want to be a burden, nor do I want you to struggle between your family, the company, and me. The Harris Group needs you, and you deserve someone who fits that life. I need to let you go. I hope you'll understand one day." Each word tore at him. He read the letter over and over, his anguish intensifying with each pass. How could Ava believe she was a burden? She was the one person who made him feel alive, who knew and loved him for who he was, not for his status or power. Without hesitation, Henry left his office, ignoring the concerned questions from colleagues and the meeting about to begin. He needed to find her. His heart raced, and all he could think was that without her, his life, all the success and prestige the Harris Group offered, would mean nothing. Arriving at Ava's apartment, Henry knocked repeatedly, the sound echoing down the empty hallway. When she finally opened the door, she looked surprised to see him, her face reflecting the turmoil within her. "Henry, what are you doing here?" she asked, attempting to keep her composure. He held up the letter, showing it to her. "I received your letter," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "How could you do this, Ava? How could you think that my life would have any meaning without you?" Ava looked away, struggling under the weight of her own decision. "Henry, I don't want you to have to choose between the Harris Group and us. I don't want to be the reason you lose your family's trust or the chance to fulfill your role at the company. They need you, and you have a legacy to uphold." He moved closer, taking her face in his hands and forcing her to look at him. "And I need you, Ava. They may have their expectations, but you're the one who completes me. You're the one who truly understands me. I can't, and I won't, let go of that." She looked back at him, tears in her eyes. "Henry, your world is too difficult. The pressures, the expectations, I don't know how to handle them. Every time we're together, I feel like I'm intruding, like I don't belong. I don't want to lose you, but I also don't want you to live torn between your family and us." Henry took a deep breath, steadying his voice. "Ava, I don't care about their expectations when I'm with you. Since you came into my life, I realized that all those pressures and obligations mean nothing without someone to share it with. And that someone is you." Ava's heart raced, but the pain of feeling out of place still haunted her. "And what about your family, Henry? What about what they expect from you? What if it all turns against us? I'm not sure I can bear that weight." He pulled her into a tight embrace, holding her as if the very act could erase all her doubts. After a moment, he stepped back slightly, gripping her shoulders as he looked into her eyes. "If I have to choose between the Harris Group and you, I choose you, Ava. It doesn't matter what they expect. It doesn't matter what obligations I have. What I want is to live my life with you, free from fear and outside pressures." Tears streamed down Ava's face as she realized that the love they shared was stronger than any barrier the world around them could erect. His decision was resolute, filled with an intensity that left no room for doubt. Henry was willing to face anything, and that moment of vulnerability made Ava realize she could be brave too. "Henry, I love you," she finally confessed, letting the words escape with all their weight. "I was afraid that by being with you, I would hold you back from achieving everything you deserve. But now I see. Maybe I just need to be strong beside you." He smiled, visibly moved, and kissed her with all the love he felt. The kiss was a promise, a reaffirmation that they were together to face whatever came their way. Family, the company, none of it mattered. What mattered was the life they were building together, fearless and unreserved. In the days that followed, Henry and Ava faced the challenges their relationship brought with open hearts. Henry made it clear to the board and his family that Ava was an essential part of his life, and her presence was non-negotiable. While some continued to show disapproval, Henry's unwavering stance gradually shifted the perception that their relationship was merely a distraction. Over time, Ava embraced her place in Henry's world without carrying the weight of insecurity. The support and confidence he offered made her feel as if together they could conquer anything. Henry's reassurance helped her find security, while she, in turn, gave him a sense of freedom from the pressures that had always burdened him. One night, as they relaxed together in his apartment, Henry took Ava's hand and looked at her with a serious expression. "No matter what happens, Ava, you're the center of my life now. What we build together is more important than any pressure they try to place on us. We're in this together, and that's all that matters." She smiled, touched, and hugged him tightly, knowing that, from that moment on, there would be no more doubts or insecurities. In each other, they had found everything they had been searching for, and together, they were ready to face whatever came, secure in the love that bound them. That evening, after an exhausting day at the office, Henry made a decision he'd been postponing. It was time to speak openly with his grandfather, Walter. Their relationship had always been complicated, filled with mutual respect, but also with unspoken expectations. Walter Harris wasn't just the founder of the Harris Group. He was a man who prized the continuity of the family legacy above all else. He was also someone Henry admired deeply. But lately, Walter's relentless insistence on controlling every aspect of Henry's personal and professional life had become a burden Henry could no longer bear. Determined to resolve the matter, Henry drove to his grandfather's estate, a stately mansion hours outside of New York. The house, silent and grand, seemed to hold the weight of the Harris family's decades-long legacy in every room. As he arrived, he was greeted by Walter, who looked surprised but invited him in, sensing that this wasn't a casual visit. They sat in a spacious room filled with mementos from the past, trophies, photos, and symbols of the family's achievements. Walter observed Henry quietly, noting the tension in his posture. "I know you don't come here without a reason, Henry. What's on your mind?" Walter asked in his usual direct, firm tone. Henry took a deep breath, gathering his courage. He wanted no pretense, and he knew his grandfather valued honesty above all else. "I came to talk about Ava, about us," Henry began, his voice steady but emotional. "I love her, and I'm ready to accept the consequences of that, even if it means losing everything the Harris Group represents to me." Walter's brow furrowed, but he remained silent, listening intently. His face betrayed no emotion, but Henry could tell his words were sinking in. "I know you've never approved of my relationship with her," Henry continued, his voice resolute. "I've tried to live up to every expectation, to fulfill each responsibility. But there comes a point when all of that loses meaning if I can't choose who I want by my side. And that person is Ava." Walter regarded Henry silently for a few moments, a faint glimmer in his eyes as if contemplating something beyond the spoken words. "You're willing to give up the Harris Group?" Walter asked, his voice low but laden with a seriousness Henry hadn't heard before. Henry nodded, his resolve unwavering. "Yes, I am. There's no purpose in leading this company if it means giving up my happiness, the woman I love. If choosing Ava means losing all of this, then so be it. I would choose her 1,000 times, even if it cost me every penny of the inheritance." Walter's expression shifted from surprise to quiet contemplation. It was as if, in that moment, he was seeing his grandson in a new light, uncovering something he hadn't anticipated. "Henry, it's not easy for a man like me to admit this, but the life I built was forged with sacrifices and choices." Walter spoke, his voice softer than usual. "When I founded the Harris Group, I believed I had to prioritize the company above all else, and I expected future generations to do the same." Henry listened intently, absorbing every word, trying to grasp the reasoning behind his grandfather's unyielding stance. "I always knew you could lead the Harris Group, Henry, but I feared that, in doing so, you'd lose sight of what truly matters. When I proposed that initial agreement, my real aim was to see how far you would go for love," Walter confessed, his voice betraying a rare vulnerability. Henry was taken aback by the revelation, looking at his grandfather with a mix of disbelief and understanding. "So all of this, the contract, the test, it was a way to gauge my commitment?" he asked, struggling to process the revelation. Walter gave a faint smile, his gaze steady. "I wanted to see if you could do what I couldn't fight for something that truly mattered to you beyond wealth and success. I made mistakes in my own life, Henry. I let people who mattered slip away because of my choices. I didn't want you to repeat those mistakes." An immense sense of understanding and relief washed over Henry. The pressure he'd felt for so long, the burden of constantly living up to the family's expectations, now seemed to dissipate. He realized that his grandfather, in his strict and calculated way, had been trying to impart a lesson about priorities, one he himself hadn't dared to confront. "So you approve of my relationship with Ava?" Henry asked, a flicker of hope in his voice. Walter nodded slowly, his gaze tired but sincere. "Yes, Henry. If you're willing to sacrifice everything for the woman you love, then you've finally grasped what I was trying to teach. Ava is a strong, principled woman. And if she's the person you've chosen, then she has my respect entirely." A profound sense of relief filled Henry. The fear and uncertainty that his family would never accept his love for Ava were finally gone. His grandfather's approval meant more than he'd anticipated, and their conversation marked the end of a chapter, an unshackling from the chains that had once held him back. "Thank you, Grandpa. This means a great deal to me," Henry said, his voice filled with emotion. Walter nodded, offering a small smile. "Just promise me, Henry, that when you're with her, you'll never lose sight of what truly matters. Never forsake true love in the name of duty. That was my greatest mistake, and I don't want you to follow that path." Henry felt the weight of those words, realizing that even his stern grandfather carried a burden of regret he hadn't fully understood before. Gratitude welled up within him, along with the desire to build a life with Ava, free from lingering doubts. That night, Henry returned to New York with a newfound sense of clarity and determination. When he arrived at Ava's apartment, she was surprised to see him, but his warm smile reassured her. Henry stepped inside and immediately embraced her, holding her close as if pouring all his unspoken feelings into that embrace. "Ava, I spoke with my grandfather. I told him everything, and he finally understands how much you mean to me," he said, looking into her eyes with a sincere smile. "He approves of us and even said I've finally learned the importance of true love. None of this would have been possible without you." She looked at him, a mixture of joy and disbelief in her expression. "Henry, that's incredible. I didn't think he'd understand so soon. I was prepared for you to have to fight for us even more," she admitted, a glimmer of relief and happiness in her eyes. He took her face in his hands, his gaze unwavering. "I was ready to give up everything, Ava. Everything. Because you're the one who gives my life meaning. You're what truly matters. With you, I feel like I found what I've been searching for all along, and nothing else, not even the Harris Group, could replace that." Ava felt tears slipping down her cheeks, but this time, they were tears of pure happiness. This was the man she loved, someone willing to face the world at her side. They shared a deep, loving kiss, a kiss filled with silent promises, certainty, and unwavering love. In the days that followed, Henry and Ava began to make plans together, now with the family's support and free from the insecurities that once held them back. Walter, though still strict and demanding in business matters, started showing subtle kindness to Ava, always treating her with respect. He had seen that the love between her and Henry was genuine, and witnessing his grandson's happiness brought him a quiet sense of satisfaction. Ava, in turn, finally felt at peace. Henry's love and unwavering support made her feel secure, valued, and cherished. She knew that life by his side would have its challenges, but now, she was certain that with Henry, she could face anything. Together, Henry and Ava had discovered that true love was not a straight path, but a journey filled with lessons, sacrifices, and triumphs. The Harris Group continued, but for Henry, the most meaningful legacy he would leave was the life he was building with her, a life based on honesty, partnership, and the boundless love they had chosen to embrace. That night marked a new beginning for Henry and Ava. After months filled with challenges, doubts, and sacrifices, they were finally free to live the love they had tried so hard to protect and conceal. Henry, with his grandfather's blessing and the certainty that Ava was the person with whom he wanted to share his life, felt lighter, as if all the pressures and barriers that once seemed insurmountable had faded. For Ava, a serene happiness had taken hold, one she hadn't felt in a long time. Henry's presence, his genuine commitment, and the support of the Harris family meant more than any declaration of love. It represented stability, security, and a place where she could be herself, valued for who she was without needing to hide her insecurities. That very night, after hearing Walter's decision and discussing their future, Henry invited Ava to a private dinner at his apartment. When she arrived, she found the space illuminated only by candlelight, adorned with flowers, an unusual touch for Henry's typically understated style. He was waiting at the door with a smile that radiated pure joy. As soon as she entered, Henry wrapped her in a tight embrace, holding her as if to make the moment last forever. "I still can't believe we're here together, with nothing to hide," he said, pulling back slightly to look into her eyes. "Now everything seems clear. You're the only certainty I have." Ava smiled, feeling his words resonate deeply within her heart. The journey they had traveled suddenly seemed worth every moment of uncertainty. "I never imagined we'd get here, Henry," she replied, her voice soft and full of emotion. "But now, there's nothing else. I want just us, together, with nothing holding us back." They looked at each other, and in that moment, they recognized how much they had each changed to open themselves to love. Henry, once so controlled and rigid, now seemed freer, ready to build a shared, uncomplicated life. Ava, who once doubted her ability to face the pressures of Henry's world, now felt confident, prepared to stand by him no matter what came their way. During dinner, their conversation was filled with memories and future plans. They talked about the challenges they had overcome, laughed at the tensest moments, and discussed the details of what had brought them here. Henry held Ava's hand throughout the meal, their fingers entwined in a sign of their indestructible connection. At one point, as they sipped wine and talked, Henry brought her hand to his lips and kissed it tenderly. There was an intensity in his simple gestures that needed no further explanation. Over time, they realized that the wine, candles, and dinner were only a backdrop to that evening. After dinner, Henry led her to the couch where they sat side by side in comfortable silence, soaking in the peace of the moment. He pulled her close, and Ava nestled beside him, feeling completely safe. "Ava," he began, after a long silence, "I want you to know that, from now on, I am committed to building something real with you. I'm not just talking about romantic plans, but about a real life together. I want you in every detail, every decision, every moment." She looked at him, surprised and moved, her heart racing at his words. "Henry, I was always afraid to believe we could have something like this, but now it all makes sense. I want that life with you too. And with you, I know I can face anything." Henry smiled, brushing his fingers along her face as if to memorize every feature. Then, he drew her in for a kiss full of tenderness and desire, a kiss that sealed the commitment they were both ready to make. There were no doubts, no fears, only the certainty that this was the right path. That night, Ava fell asleep beside Henry, and both of them shared the serenity of finally being together, having overcome obstacles and finally being able to be a real couple. They woke up at dawn, and Henry, smiling, served breakfast in bed while they exchanged laughter and teased each other about the future. The days that followed were filled with a tranquil happiness and a love that deepened with each passing day. Ava became a constant presence at Henry's side, at corporate engagements and social events, now in an official capacity. His demeanor changed visibly whenever he introduced her to colleagues and acquaintances. He was proud of his love for her and didn't hesitate to show it at every opportunity. At a Harris Group event filled with important investors and prominent figures, Henry held Ava's hand confidently as he led her through the room, introducing her to everyone as his official partner. There was no more calculated aloofness. He was open and genuine, as if proudly presenting the woman who completed him. "I'd like to introduce you to Ava," he said with a sincere smile as he introduced her to one of the company's top investors. "She's become a huge part of my life, and from now on, she'll be with me every step of the way." Ava stood beside him, feeling Henry's proud gaze and noticing the respect he conveyed by including her in his world. For her, being beside him in this way was confirmation that all the obstacles had been worth it, and that they had finally found a way to be together without reservations. After the event, on their way home, Henry stopped the car at an overlook with a view of the city. It was a clear night, and the city lights twinkled in the distance. He helped her out of the car, and as they stood there together, gazing at the view, he was quiet for a few moments. "You know, Ava," he said thoughtfully, "I don't think I've ever been this at peace. Looking out at all of this, I realize how little it all means without you. All the power, all the achievements. None of it would matter if you weren't by my side." Ava looked at him, smiling as she held his hand. "And I never thought I could be a part of this, Henry. But now I see that with you, I can be myself and feel truly at home. It doesn't matter where we are, as long as we're together." He pulled her into an embrace, and at that moment, they knew they had found what they'd been searching for. The security, love, and respect they shared formed a foundation that nothing could shake. From then on, they were truly a couple, united not just by love, but by a commitment to face anything that came their way. As the weeks passed, Henry and Ava began making plans for the future, discussing dreams and goals that once seemed distant or uncertain. Henry involved her in every major decision, and Ava, now confident in her place beside him, felt fulfilled by the chance to share so much of her life with him. One of the most meaningful moments occurred when Walter, Henry's grandfather, made an unexpected visit to their apartment. He observed them in silence for a few moments, as if absorbing the happiness and connection that bound them, and with a faint smile, finally gave them his blessing. "Henry, Ava," he said, his voice filled with sincerity and respect, "I see now that you both have what it takes to build a life together, and that's what truly matters. May you stay united and support each other, no matter what obstacles come your way." Walter's words were received with gratitude, and Henry and Ava both understood that this moment symbolized the final dismantling of any barriers between them and the family. It was the ultimate acceptance, the blessing of someone who, though stern, genuinely wanted to see them happy and fulfilled. From that day forward, Henry and Ava set out to build together what once seemed impossible. Their lives were intertwined in an unbreakable bond, and the love they shared grew deeper and more genuine with each day. They had faced pressures, insecurities, and fears, and finally reached a place where they could be themselves without reservations, without doubts. It was only the beginning of a new chapter, but now they were ready, together, for whatever the future would bring. The day of Henry's inauguration as president of the Harris Group had finally arrived. The company's grand hall, filled with family, executives, investors, and New York's elite, was abuzz with anticipation. This was more than just a pivotal event for the company. It was a defining moment in Henry and Ava's lives. What had started as a simple contract and a family obligation had turned into the unexpected first step toward a love neither of them had imagined. Standing beside Henry in a deep blue gown, Ava felt the significance of the moment. She knew how much this role meant to him, but she also knew that he was taking it on now as a choice, not as an obligation. For Henry, Ava's presence marked the completion of his journey to find the balance he had sought. He felt whole, grounded in the knowledge that he had by his side someone who loved him not for his power or status but for who he was. As he ascended the stage to deliver his inaugural address, Henry cast a look at Ava, who gave him an encouraging nod and a proud smile. He felt his heart swell, knowing that he could never have reached this point without her love and support. "Today, I take on the role of president of the Harris Group with a commitment to honor my family's legacy and build a dynamic and authentic future for this company," he began, scanning the audience. "But I also want to share that this moment is only truly complete because I have beside me the person who reminds me every day of what truly matters." Henry turned his gaze to Ava with a smile, and she returned the look, her eyes filled with emotion. The guest saw that this was more than just a professional speech. It was a sincere declaration that the new president was committed not only to the company, but also to a life guided by genuine values. After the ceremony, Henry and Ava were congratulated by family, friends, and colleagues. Walter, who had watched his grandson's journey and witnessed his transformation, shook Henry's hand with visible pride. "I'm proud of you, Henry. You've shown strength and courage in forging your own path. And more importantly, you've shown that you understand the true things worth valuing in life," said Walter, casting a nod of approval toward Ava. Ava smiled, grateful for Walter's unexpected support, and felt that his gesture symbolized a final blessing for their relationship. Now Henry and she had the respect and support of the family. But most importantly, they had each other, a love that no outside validation could ever replace. After the ceremony, Henry and Ava decided to celebrate privately. They returned to his apartment, where the table was set with flowers, and Ava realized with a smile that he had planned every detail of the evening. She could never have imagined that the journey beginning with a contract would culminate in such a genuine love and a relationship that overflowed with happiness and partnership. As they shared a homemade dinner, Ava looked at Henry, her eyes shining. "I never imagined this contract would bring us here. It feels almost surreal," she said with a soft laugh. Henry chuckled, holding her hand across the table. "Neither did I. When my grandfather imposed that condition, I thought it would be impossible to feel anything real. But then you came along and changed everything. Thank you, Ava, for believing in us even when I was lost." She smiled, touched by his sincerity, and felt warmth spread through her heart. "It was a long road, Henry, but every challenge was worth it. Choosing you was the best decision I ever made, and I wouldn't change a single part of our story." He leaned closer, brushing her cheek with tenderness. "And I can't imagine life without you. This is just the beginning, Ava. I want us to be a team, not just in work or society, but in every part of our lives." They shared a deep, promising kiss, and at that moment, they knew they were exactly where they were meant to be. Whatever the future held, they had each other, and this love would be the strength that kept them together. Later that night, as they toasted and reminisced about the difficult moments, the twists and the trials they had overcome together, the memory of the contract felt like a distant story, almost surreal. Each obstacle they had faced only served to strengthen their commitment to each other. In time, Henry and Ava began not only building a life together, but creating a legacy of their own. Henry led the Harris Group with a renewed vision, incorporating values previously missing in the company's culture, and Ava became an essential partner in his projects. She inspired him to pursue innovative paths and stay true to the values they both held dear. Life in the social and corporate worlds continued, but now they faced challenges with the confidence that nothing could disrupt what they had built. Once viewed as an outsider, Ava had now gained the admiration and respect of those around her, recognized for her authenticity and integrity. One day, as they strolled through Central Park, Henry stopped suddenly and took her hand, looking deeply into her eyes. "Ava, you've taught me to love without reservations. To see that true success isn't just in business, but in the people we choose to have beside us. I want you to know that nothing in this world will ever change how I feel about you. What we've built together is the most precious thing in my life." Ava smiled, feeling emotion well up in her chest. "Henry, you're the love I never expected to find. And with you, I feel I can face anything. I'm here, today and always." They embraced, lost in the depth of their shared feelings. The love between them was a choice they renewed each day, a commitment needing no contracts or obligations. It was real, a connection built on trust, companionship, and mutual respect. Henry and Ava had found, finally, a true happy ending. And it wasn't merely the conclusion of a story, but the beginning of a beautiful life together.